good evening, or perhaps good morning, if the terrors of the night have kept you from your rest. I am Eli Nightfall, and it's a distinct, if somewhat unsettling, pleasure to have you join me once more. The world outside may be hushed, cloaked in the deceptive tranquility of encroaching darkness, or perhaps the pale light of a reluctant dawn. But here, within the confines of this story, the shadows are stirring, and something ancient, something hungry, is about to awaken. Tonight, we journey to a place where the pursuit of knowledge twists into an unholy obsession, where the vibrant beauty of nature conceals a terrifying secret. We step into the world of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of science, a recluse by choice, whose life was dedicated to the quiet, meticulous study of the botanical world. His home, a sprawling, somewhat dilapidated Victorian house, stood on the outskirts of a town that had long since learned to leave him to his eccentricities. It was a place of hushed corridors and dust-sheeted rooms, but its heart, its true, beating core, was the vast iron and glass greenhouse appended to its western wing. This greenhouse was Alistair's sanctuary, his laboratory, his cathedral. Within its humid confines, under panes of glass often misted with condensation or streaked with rain, he cultivated wonders from across the globe. Rare orchids that mimicked the most exotic insects, carnivorous pitcher plants with gaping maws, ferns that unfurled with prehistoric grace. He understood their silent language, their subtle needs, their delicate chemistries. Or so he believed. Our story begins not with a thunderclap or a scream, but with a small, unassuming package that arrived on a damp Tuesday morning. The postmark was smudged, the sender unknown, or at least not one Alistair readily recognized. Inside, nestled amongst wood shavings, was a single, dried seed pod, unlike anything he had encountered in his 53 years of botanical exploration. It was roughly the size of a robin's egg, its surface a dull, mottled brown, with faint, almost imperceptible tracings that resembled desiccated veins. There was no note, no explanation, just the pod itself, exuding an air of ancient dormancy. Alistair, a man not easily given to flights of fancy, found himself inexplicably drawn to it. He spent the better part of that afternoon in his study, poring over his extensive collection of botanical texts, cross-referencing, comparing, searching for any species that matched this strange acquisition. He found nothing. The seed pod remained an enigma, a silent challenge to his expertise. The mystery of it was a potent lure, a siren song to his scientific curiosity. Days turned into weeks. Alistair meticulously prepared a special blend of soil, sterilized his tools, and with the reverence of a priest before an altar, he carefully extracted the seeds from the pod. They were small, black, and oddly smooth, almost polished, reflecting the weak afternoon light that filtered through the greenhouse glass like tiny, obsidian tears. He planted them in a terracotta pot in a secluded corner of the greenhouse, away from his more conventional specimens. And then he waited. He watered them with distilled water. Ensure the temperature was optimal, the humidity just so. He checked on them daily, his anticipation a low hum beneath his usual meticulous routines. But the seeds remained stubbornly inert. Other, more cooperative plants sprouted and thrived around them, unfurling tender leaves, reaching towards the light. But the patch of soil where the obsidian seeds lay buried remained barren. A small, dark reproach. Frustration began to gnaw at Alistair. He, who could coax life from the most recalcitrant of specimens, was failing. He tried varying the soil pH, adjusting the light exposure, even whispering to them, an old habit from his more fanciful youth that he'd thought long abandoned. Nothing. The seeds slept on, their silence a growing affront. Weeks stretched into a month. Then, too, the pot became a symbol of his rare impotence in the face of nature's mysteries. He considered discarding it, moving on to other, more rewarding projects. But something held him back, a flicker of that initial fascination, a stubborn refusal to admit defeat, or perhaps a premonition that this was no ordinary dormancy. It was on a late evening, the rain lashing against the greenhouse glass like angry claws, the wind howling a mournful dirge around the eaves of the old house, that the first sign occurred. Alistair had been working late, meticulously cataloging a new species of Amazonian lily. A slight misjudgment of distance, a moment of weariness, and the sharp edge of a metal specimen tag caught the back of his hand. Not a deep cut, but enough to draw a surprising amount of blood. He hissed in annoyance, reaching for a rag, and as he did, 3 plump, crimson drops fell, unseen by him, onto the barren soil of the forgotten pot. He cleaned his wound, wrapped it, and, muttering about his own clumsiness, prepared to retire for the night. The storm outside mirroring a subtle disquiet within him. He barely glanced at the pot as he passed. Had he looked closer, he might have seen the dark earth tremble ever so slightly where his blood had fallen. He might have noticed the faintest, almost imperceptible stirring beneath the surface. But he didn't. The air fresh and cool. Alistair entered the greenhouse, his routine already asserting itself. He made his rounds, checking temperatures, misting delicate ferns, his mind already cataloging the tasks for the day. And then he stopped. He stopped so abruptly that the watering can he carried sloshed, spilling a clear stream onto the flagstone path. He stared. In the pot, the one that had been barren for so long, the soil was disturbed. Not just disturbed, but cracked, and thrusting its way upwards with an almost aggressive vitality, was a single, pale green shoot. It hadn't been there the night before. He was certain of it. This was not the slow, tentative emergence of a normal seedling. This was an eruption. The shoot was thick for a newborn, and as he knelt closer, his heart beginning a strange, arrhythmic beat, he saw that its tip was already unfurling into 2 tiny, nascent leaves. But it was the color that held him captive. They were not the vibrant, healthy green of a typical sprout. They were a pale, almost anemic green, yet at their very edges there was the faintest, almost invisible blush of something else. Something darker. Alistair frowned, his scientific mind racing, trying to reconcile this sudden, vigorous growth with months of inactivity. Had the storm somehow triggered it? A change in atmospheric pressure? A subtle electrical charge in the air? He reached out a tentative finger, touching the surface of the soil near the base of the shoot. It was still damp from his accidental watering the previous day, but also different. Where his blood had fallen, the soil seemed richer. Darker, almost fed. A shiver, cold and unsettling, traced its way down his spine. It was an absurd thought, a notion from a Gothic novel, not the rational world of botany. Plants did not feed on blood. Not like this. Carnivorous plants, yes, they trapped insects, dissolved them for nutrients. But this felt different. Primal. He spent the rest of the day observing the seedling. Its growth was astonishing, almost visible to the naked eye. By late afternoon, the 2 leaves had fully unfurled, larger now, their pale green surfaces tinged more noticeably at the edges with a deep, Venus red, like a blush spreading through pale skin. It seemed to lean, almost imperceptibly, towards the spot where his blood had nourished the soil. The rational part of Alistair's brain dismissed the notion as fanciful, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by solitude and the mystery of the seed's origin. But another part, a deeper, more instinctual part, felt a prickle of unease, a whisper of something ancient and unknown stirring in his sanctuary. The plant was alive, undeniably, but what precisely had awakened it? And more importantly, what would it demand to continue its astonishing, unnatural growth? The answer, he suspected, lay in the crimson drops he had inadvertently offered, a libation unknowingly given to a thirst he was only just beginning to comprehend. The air in the greenhouse suddenly felt colder, the familiar sense of damp earth and blooming flowers now mingling with a new, almost metallic tang that he couldn't quite place. The garden he had so meticulously cultivated was about to reveal a secret far darker than any he could have ever imagined. The first feeding, accidental though it was, had begun, and the true price of its bloom was yet to be paid. The rain has stopped now, hasn't it? But listen closely. Can you hear the silence from within Dr. Finch's greenhouse? It's a silence filled with a terrible, growing potential. Stay with me as we watch what happens next. Chapter 1. The Crimson Seedling. Dr. Alistair Finch considered his greenhouse not merely an extension of his dilapidated Victorian home, but the very epicenter of his existence. It was a world meticulously constructed, a humid haven where the air hung thick with the scent of damp earth, exotic pollens, and the subtle, almost metallic tang of oxidizing iron from the aging framework. Here, amidst the verdant chaos of rare orchids, towering ferns, and peculiar succulents, Alistair found a solace that the human world, with its clumsy interactions and unpredictable emotions, could never offer. He was a man of precise habits and quiet dedication. His days measured by the unfurling of new leaves and the subtle shifts in temperature and humidity he so carefully controlled. His hands, though often stained with soil and chlorophyll, moved with a surgeon's delicacy among his botanical charges. He understood the silent language of plants, their needs, their vulnerabilities, their quiet triumphs of survival. Or so he had always believed until the arrival of the package. It had come on a blustery Tuesday, unannounced, its origins obscured by a smudged postmark from some forgotten corner of the globe. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry wood shavings, lay a single, ovoid seed pod. It was unremarkable in color, a dull, dusty brown, yet its texture was strangely compelling, like old, dried leather, with faint, darker lines crisscrossing its surface, resembling nothing so much as a network of desiccated veins. There was no accompanying letter, no explanation, only the pod itself, exuding an aura of ancient dormancy and profound mystery. Alistair, a man whose curiosity was as deeply ingrained as his reclusiveness, was immediately captivated. He spent the next several days in his vast, book-lined study, surrounded by leather-bound botanical tomes and meticulously illustrated monographs, searching for any known species that matched his strange acquisition. His search proved fruitless. The seed pod remained an enigma, a tantalizing puzzle that whispered of unknown ecosystems and undiscovered life. The challenge it presented was irresistible, with a reverence usually reserved for the rarest of specimens. Alistair prepared for germination. He selected a terracotta pot of medium size, filled it with a carefully composed mixture of sterilized loam, peat, and fine sand, ensuring optimal drainage. He then, with a delicate scalpel, carefully incised the tough outer casing of the pod. Inside, a dozen or so seeds lay embedded in a dry, pithy matrix. They were small, no larger than peppercorns, but their appearance was striking, a deep, polished black, like chips of obsidian, gleaming faintly in the weak afternoon light that filtered through the grimy panes of the greenhouse. He planted them with care, spacing them evenly, covering them with a light layer of his prepared soil. He placed the pot in a relatively secluded section of the greenhouse, one that received ample, if indirect, sunlight and where the humidity was consistently high. Then, the waiting began. Days bled into weeks. Alistair tended to the pot with his customary diligence, monitoring the moisture levels, ensuring the temperature remained within the narrow parameters he deemed ideal. He spoke to it, sometimes, a low murmur of encouragement, a habit he'd never quite managed to shed, a relic of a childhood spent amongst his grandfather's more conventional gardens. But the obsidian seeds offered no response. The soil above them remained undisturbed, a patch of barren earth in his otherwise thriving kingdom. Around it, orchids unfurled delicate, painted lips, ferns stretched feathery fronds towards the light, and carnivorous pitcher plants patiently awaited their insect prey. The contrast only heightened Alistair's growing frustration. He, Alistair Finch, whose touch could coax blooms from the most stubborn desert rose and roots from the most recalcitrant cutting, was being defied by these silent, black beads. He altered the watering schedule, experimented with minute changes in soil acidity, even introduced trace elements he hypothesized might be missing. Still nothing. The pot became a small monument to his failure, a quiet rebuke to his decades of accumulated knowledge. He began to resent its passive resistance, the way it sat there, inert, mocking his efforts. He considered more than once simply discarding it, tipping the contents onto the compost heap, and forgetting this particular botanical puzzle. Yet, something always stayed his hand. Perhaps it was the mystery of its origins, the silent promise of discovery it still held, or simply his innate stubbornness, a refusal to be bested by a mere handful of seeds. He would not give up, not yet. The greenhouse, usually his sanctuary, began to feel subtly different, the presence of the stubbornly dormant seeds casting a small shadow over his daily routines. His other plants, usually a source of uncomplicated joy, now seemed to reproach him with their effortless vitality. He found his gaze drawn, again and again, to that small circle of barren earth, a tiny void in his carefully curated world. The air in the greenhouse, always heavy with the breath of living things, seemed to carry a new, almost imperceptible tension awaiting. Alistair, however, was not a man to be easily deterred by initial setbacks. He saw it as a test, a challenge to his skills and patience. He redoubled his research, scouring obscure journals and forgotten expedition logs, hoping for a clue, a forgotten piece of botanical lore that might unlock the secret of the obsidian seeds. The pursuit consumed his evenings, the flickering gaslight in his study casting long, dancing shadows on the towering bookshelves as he delved deeper into the arcane corners of his field. He was a scholar, a scientist, and this mystery, this stubborn refusal of life, was a gauntlet thrown down. He would pick it up. He would understand. He had to. The silence from the pot, however, continued profound and absolute. The incident, when it finally occurred, was mundane, a moment of careless haste in a life usually defined by meticulous precision. Alistair had been working late into the evening. The rhythmic drumming of a persistent autumn rain against the greenhouse glass, a soothing counterpoint to the focused silence within. He was repotting a particularly delicate species of Andean cloud orchid, its aerial roots like fine silver threads demanding a gentle touch. His mind, however, was elsewhere, wrestling with the frustrating enigma of the obsidian seeds. He reached for a fresh bag of sphagnum moss, his movements a little too quick, his attention divided. The rough edge of a nearby metal shelf, unseen in the dimming light, caught the back of his left hand. It wasn't a deep wound, more a long, shallow scratch, but it was enough. Blood, startlingly crimson against his pale skin, welled up instantly, tracing a path down his wrist. He cursed softly, more in annoyance at his own clumsiness than in pain. He was usually so careful. He set down the orchid, instinctively pressing his other hand against the bleeding scratch, and looked around for a clean rag. There was one on a nearby potting bench, and as he moved towards it, his injured hand hanging loosely at his side, 3 fat drops of blood detached themselves from his skin. They fell, unnoticed by Alistair in his minor distress, directly onto the surface of the soil in the pot containing the obsidian seeds. He found a rag, pressed it firmly to the wound, and after a moment, the bleeding subsided to a slow ooze. He cleaned the scratch with antiseptic from his small first aid kit kept in the greenhouse, applied a sterile dressing, and then, with a sigh of irritation, decided to call it a night. The mood for delicate botanical work had been broken. He tidied his tools, his thoughts already turning toward a warm cup of tea and the latest issue of the Journal of Cryptogamic Botany. He cast a cursory glance at the offending pot as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of its continued defiance. The surface of the soil looked no different, dark and damp under the artificial glow of the single work light he'd left on. He saw nothing amiss. He locked the greenhouse door behind him, the sound of the tumblers clicking into place echoing slightly in the rain-swept emptiness of the garden. The wind sighed through the ancient yews that bordered his property, their branches tracing skeletal patterns against the bruised purple of the night sky. Inside the now silent greenhouse, the air remained heavy and still. For a long while, nothing changed. Then, where Alistair's blood had soaked into the soil, the dark earth seemed to pulse. Just once, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. A single, fine crack appeared on the surface, then another, radiating outwards like a miniature fault line. Slowly, tentatively, something began to push upwards. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, the earlier rain having given way to a chill, damp mist that clung to the landscape. Alistair, his hand throbbing dully beneath its bandage, entered the greenhouse with his customary cup of weak tea, his mind already on the day's tasks. He intended to finally address the problematic drainage in the fernery. As he made his usual circuit, checking for any overnight changes, his gaze fell upon the pot of obsidian seeds. He stopped. The teacup clattered in its saucer. The surface of the soil was broken, not subtly, not with the tentative emergence of a typical seedling, but decisively. A single robust shoot, pale to the point of translucence, thicker than any seedling he had ever seen, had speared its way upwards, easily an inch tall. It had not been there the night before. He was absolutely, unequivocally certain of it. He knelt, his earlier irritation forgotten, replaced by a sudden, prickling sense of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a profound unease, a disturbance in the natural order he held so dear. The shoot was almost featureless, a smooth, fleshy stalk, but at its tip, two nascent leaves were already beginning to unfurl. He leaned closer, his breath misting in the cool air. The pale green of the emerging leaves was not uniform. At their very edges, almost invisible to the casual eye, was the faintest blush of a darker color. A hint of crimson, like capillaries visible beneath skin too thin. He touched the soil near the base of the shoot. It was cool and damp. His eyes traced the area where he now vaguely remembered his blood might have fallen. The soil there seemed subtly different, more friable, almost enriched. A bizarre, unwelcome thought flickered at the edge of his consciousness. A thought so outlandish, so contrary to every tenet of botanical science he knew, that he almost dismissed it out of hand. Almost. But the evidence was there, thrusting upwards with an undeniable, almost aggressive vitality. The silence of months had been broken, not by his patient ministrations, not by light or water or carefully balanced nutrients, but, it seemed, by blood. His blood, the air in the greenhouse, usually so comforting in its familiar sense, suddenly felt charged, alien. The ordinary rustle of leaves in a stray draft sounded like whispers. The crimson seedling stood as a silent, vibrant testament to an unknown, unsettling biological imperative. Alistair Finch, master of his botanical domain, felt a tremor of something akin to awe mingled with a nascent, chilling dread. The game had changed. The mystery had deepened, and its implications were beginning to feel profoundly, terrifyingly personal. Chapter 2. First Blood, First Bloom. The days that followed the seedling's dramatic emergence were marked by an intensity of observation Alistair had rarely felt. The initial shock, the unsettling implication of his accidental blood offering, slowly gave way to a scientist's ingrained compulsion to understand. He documented every minute change in the plant with meticulous, almost feverish precision. Its growth was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The pale, fleshy stem thickened daily, and the nascent leaves unfurled with astonishing speed, revealing their strange, compelling coloration more clearly. They were indeed a pale, almost ghostly green, but this was overlaid, particularly at the margins and along the delicate tracery of their veins, with a hue that shifted from a subtle blush to a deep, rich crimson. as if the very lifeblood of some unknown creature pulsed within them. The plant showed an almost unnerving vitality. It seemed to actively reach towards the light source, its movements, though imperceptible in real time, clearly evident when comparing his daily sketches and photographs. But it was the soil that truly captured his attention. The area where his blood had fallen remained subtly darker, and the plant's single root, which he carefully, partially excavated one afternoon with a fine dental pick, seemed to be angling directly towards that enriched patch. The rational part of Alistair's mind, the part that had authored respected monographs on plant nutrition and soil chemistry, rebelled against the conclusion that was forming with increasing, undeniable clarity. It was preposterous. Plants were autotrophs, creators of their own sustenance through the elegant miracle of photosynthesis. Some, like his carnivorous specimens, supplemented their diet with nitrogen gleaned from insects. A fascinating adaptation, but still within the recognized bounds of the natural world. This was something else entirely. Yet, the evidence was before him, vibrant and undeniable. The obsidian seeds had lain dormant for months, resisting every conventional method of germination. Then a few drops of his blood, and life had erupted with savage, almost immediate vigor. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the scientist in him, the seeker of truth, however unpalatable, could not let it rest there. He had to know. The experiment, if it could be called that, was ethically repugnant, even to a man as detached from conventional sensibilities as Alistair. To deliberately wound himself, to offer his own blood as sustenance to a botanical specimen, felt like a transgression against some fundamental law, a perversion of his lifelong dedication to nurturing life. Yet, the pull of the unknown, the sheer, unprecedented nature of the phenomenon, was a siren song he found increasingly difficult to resist. He wrestled with it for 2 days, his sleep troubled by bizarre dreams of pulsating, blood-red flowers and whispering leaves. He found himself neglecting his other plants, his usual routines disrupted by the obsessive focus on this single, enigmatic seedling. The greenhouse, his sanctuary, began to feel like a laboratory for some forbidden alchemy. On the third morning, his resolve, or perhaps his resistance, broke. With a sense of grim determination and a tremor in his hand that had nothing to do with the cool morning air, he sterilized a small lancet, one he usually reserved for taking precise tissue samples. He stared at the pale skin on the inside of his forearm, the blue veins a delicate map beneath the surface. He hesitated, the cold steel of the lancet glinting. Then, with a quick, decisive movement, he made a small incision, no larger than the one he'd accidentally inflicted days before. Crimson welled up, a single, perfect droplet. He held his arm over the pot, allowing 3 more drops to fall onto the soil, a little distance from the base of the now thriving seedling. He watched, his breath held, as the dark earth drank in the offering. There was no immediate, theatrical response. The plant simply stood there, its crimson-tinged leaves silently absorbing the morning light. Alistair felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps it was all just a bizarre series of coincidences. He bandaged his arm and tried to turn his attention to other tasks, but his gaze kept drifting back to the pot, a knot of anticipation tightening in his chest. It was later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, slanted shadows across the greenhouse floor, that he saw it. The seedling, which had been perhaps 2 inches tall that morning, had visibly stretched, its stem thicker, its leaves larger, more richly colored. The crimson hue was more pronounced, no longer a mere blush, but a dominant, almost luminous shade, particularly where the light caught it. It was undeniably, demonstrably larger, and it seemed to be leaning ever so slightly towards the freshly bloodied soil. A cold thrill, part horror, part exhilaration, coursed through Alistair. He was no longer dealing with a mere botanical curiosity. He was cultivating something that actively, demonstrably, responded to blood. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and to a mind like Alistair's, utterly, irresistibly fascinating. The taboo had been broken, a line crossed, and the plant had rewarded his transgression with undeniable, vibrant life. The pact, unspoken and unholy, had been sealed. The following week was a blur of controlled experimentation and mounting, almost fearful awe. Alistair, now fully committed to understanding the plant's unique needs, established a careful regimen. Every other day, he would make a small incision, always in a different, discreet location on his arms or legs, easily concealed by his clothing, and offer a few drops of his blood to the hungry soil. The plant responded with an almost terrifying alacrity. It grew at a prodigious rate, its stem thickening to the diameter of his thumb, its leaves expanding, each one a masterpiece of pale green and visceral crimson, the colors swirling together like some demonic artist's palette. They were cool to the touch, with a texture like fine, supple leather, and they seemed to almost shimmer in the filtered light of the greenhouse. What was even more unsettling was the way the plant seemed to anticipate its feedings. On the designated days, Alistair could swear its leaves were more vibrant, its posture more erect, as if in eager expectation. He knew it was likely anthropomorphism, his isolated mind projecting human-like qualities onto a specimen, but the feeling was persistent, unnerving. He meticulously documented everything. The exact amount of blood offered, measured by counting the drops, a crude but consistent method, the corresponding growth in height and leaf diameter, the subtle changes in coloration. His notebooks filled with precise measurements, detailed sketches, and increasingly speculative, often disturbing hypotheses. He theorized about unknown enzymes, unique metabolic pathways, a form of symbiosis so alien it defied existing biological paradigms. He was venturing into uncharted territory, a pioneer on a dark and lonely frontier of science. The plant was no longer a mere seedling. It was rapidly becoming a substantial, almost formidable, presence in the greenhouse. It towered over the surrounding pots, its strange beauty both captivating and deeply unsettling. And then it began to prepare for its first bloom. It started subtly, a slight swelling at the apex of the main stem, a tightening of the terminal leaves. Alistair watched, his anticipation now tinged with a distinct apprehension. What manner of flower would such a creature produce? He increased the feedings slightly, driven by an instinct that the plant would require more sustenance for this crucial developmental stage. His own body was beginning to register the repeated small bloodlettings. He felt a persistent, low-level fatigue, a slight pallor to his skin that his loose clothing and reclusive lifestyle helped conceal. But the weariness was a small price to pay, he told himself, for the knowledge he was gaining, for the privilege of witnessing this unprecedented botanical event. The bud formed slowly at first, then with increasing speed, swelling into a tight, pointed globe. It surfaced the same pale green as the leaves, but shot through with deeper, almost black, veins of crimson. It pulsed, or so Alistair imagined in his more heightened moments, with a slow, rhythmic life. He found himself spending hours just watching it, his other work, his correspondence, even his meals, largely forgotten. The greenhouse became his entire world, and the budding plant its undeniable, demanding center. The night the bloom began to open, a strange stillness fell over the greenhouse. The usual nocturnal rustlings of leaves and the chirping of crickets seemed muted, as if in deference. Alistair sat on a small stool before the plant, a single lantern casting a flickering, inadequate light, his face etched with a mixture of scientific fervor and a primal, almost superstitious dread. Slowly, inexorably, the sepals began to part. They peeled back not like the petals of a familiar flower, but like the unfurling of some leathery, alien appendage. The color within was breathtaking. It was a red so deep, so vibrant. It seemed to absorb the lantern light, glowing with an internal luminescence. It was the red of arterial blood, of raw meat, of forbidden desires. As the bloom opened further, it revealed a complex structure, layers of velvety, blood-red petals surrounding a central stigma that was almost startlingly black, like a void drawing in the eye. And then came the scent. It was not the sweet, cloying fragrance of a typical flower. It was different, rich, heavy, with an undertone that was both musky and faintly metallic, like the scent of freshly turned earth mingled with something more primal, something disturbingly organic. It was not unpleasant. In fact, Alistair found it strangely, intoxicatingly alluring. He leaned closer, mesmerized. The flower, fully open now, was easily 6 inches across, a grotesque yet stunning masterpiece of unnatural selection. Its beauty was undeniable, but it was a dangerous, predatory beauty, the beauty of a panther, of a perfectly crafted weapon. Alistair reached out a trembling finger, hesitating for a moment before touching the edge of a petal. It felt like warm velvet, impossibly soft, yet with an underlying firmness, a sense of coiled strength. A wave of dizziness washed over him, whether from blood loss, the strange perfume, or sheer, overwhelming emotion, he couldn't tell. He felt a profound, almost spiritual connection to this creature he had nurtured, this beautiful monster he had brought into being. It was his creation, his discovery, his secret, the first bloom of the Sanguinaria nocturna, as he had provisionally, privately, named it, the night-blooming blood drinker. The name felt both clinically appropriate and chillingly accurate. The bloom, in its unholy splendor, lasted for 3 days. During that time, Alistair was its devoted attendant. He sketched it from every angle, photographed it in different lights, documented the subtle shifts in its color and texture as it reached its peak and then, slowly, began to fade. The intoxicating scent filled the greenhouse, a constant, heady reminder of the plant's unique nature. He found himself breathing it deeply, a strange sense of euphoria mixing with the underlying unease. His scientific detachment was warring with a more visceral, almost reverent fascination. He was a man of science, yet he felt like a high priest tending to an ancient, bloodthirsty deity. The practicalities of the situation, however, could not be ignored. The plant, having expended so much energy on its spectacular bloom, was clearly demanding more sustenance. The small, bi-daily offerings from his own arm were, he suspected, no longer sufficient for its burgeoning needs. He noticed a slight dulling of its vibrant crimson, a subtle wilting at the edges of its lower leaves. Signs of a hunger that his own increasingly taxed physiology might struggle to meet. The initial bloom, magnificent as it was, had only whetted its appetite. Alistair found himself pacing the confines of the greenhouse, his mind racing. His own blood was a finite resource, and the repeated small woundings, while not yet debilitating, were taking a toll. He felt perpetually tired, his concentration wavering at times. If he wanted this research to continue, if he wished to see more blooms, to understand the full life cycle of this extraordinary organism, he needed a more sustainable and larger source of blood. The thought, once entertained only in the darkest recesses of his mind, now presented itself with a stark, undeniable logic. Animals, small animals perhaps, rabbits from the overgrown woods bordering his property, or even rats, which were a perennial nuisance in the older outbuildings. The idea was distasteful, a significant escalation from his own carefully controlled offerings. It meant actively taking a life, albeit an animal one, specifically for the purpose of feeding his creation. It was a chilling prospect, yet the alternative, allowing the Sanguinaria nocturna to wither, to fail. After all he had invested, all he had discovered, was becoming unthinkable. His obsession had taken root as deeply as the plant itself. He considered the local butcher. Old Man Hemlock was a gruff but not unkind individual who supplied the few remaining residents of the village. Perhaps he could procure animal blood, waste from the slaughtering process. He could concoct a story, a need for blood meal for his more conventional plants, a traditional, if somewhat old-fashioned, fertilizer. It was a plausible lie, one that might pass without too much scrutiny in a community that had long regarded him as an eccentric. The decision weighed heavily on him. It was a clear, undeniable step down a darker path. A move from passive, if ethically dubious, self-experimentation to active procurement, to a direct engagement with the very essence of what his plant craved. But as he looked at the magnificent, fading bloom, its velvety petals now tinged with the first hints of decay, and then at the still vibrant leaves below, leaves that seemed to silently implore him, he knew what he had to do. The science, the discovery, the sheer, terrible beauty of it all demanded it. The first bloom had been bought with his own blood. The next, he realized with a cold certainty, would require something more. His garden was growing, and so too were its demands. Chapter 3. The Whispering Leaves. Alistair's initial attempts to secure a more substantial blood supply were met with a mixture of practicality and distaste. He first visited Hemlock's butcher shop, a dim, cool establishment that always smelled faintly of sawdust and iron. The bell above the door jingled with a cheerfulness that felt alien to Alistair's current state of mind. Hemlock, a stout man with forearms like tree trunks and a blood-stained apron that seemed a permanent fixture, greeted him with a grunt of surprise. Alistair rarely ventured into the village. Stumbling through a fabricated explanation about needing rich organic supplements for some particularly demanding new hybrids, Alistair managed to purchase a large bucket of congealed animal blood. Mostly pig and cattle, a byproduct Hemlock was usually happy to dispose of. The transaction felt sordid, furtive, and Alistair carried the heavy, sloshing bucket back to his property under the cover of dusk, feeling like a ghoul. The Sanguinaria and Nocturna responded to the animal blood with an almost disdainful initial reluctance. When Alistair first watered its base with a diluted, dark liquid, the plant seemed to hesitate. Its leaves, which usually perked up visibly after his own offerings, remained impassive for several hours. Alistair felt a pang of fear. Had he miscalculated? Was its taste too specific, too refined for such crude sustenance? But then, slowly, almost grudgingly, the plant began to absorb the offering. The crimson in its leaves deepened, though perhaps not with the same startling vibrancy his own blood had elicited. It was a subtle difference, but one Alistair, with his keenly observant eye, noted with a disquieting sense of its preference. Nevertheless, the animal blood sustained it, fueled its continued growth. The stem thickened further, new leaves unfurled, larger and more robust than before. It was clear that the sheer volume of nutrients, even if of a less preferred vintage, was promoting its physical development. Alistair established a routine, discreetly acquiring blood from Hemlock twice a week. Supplementing it with the occasional rabbit he managed to trap in the overgrown woods, an activity he found profoundly unpleasant. The snap of the trap, the animal's last, terrified struggles, haunting his already troubled sleep. His greenhouse, once a place of quiet contemplation and scientific endeavor, was becoming a charnel house in miniature. The faint, coppery scent of blood, now a permanent undercurrent to the richer perfumes of his other, more benign flora. It was during this period, as the plant thrived on its new, more abundant diet, that Alistair began to notice the other changes. Subtle at first, easily dismissed as tricks of the light or products of his increasingly isolated and stressed mind. The leaves of the Sanguinaria nocturna, vast and leathery now, each one the size of a dinner plate, seemed to possess a disconcerting awareness. When he moved around the greenhouse, he would catch, from the corner of his eye, a slow, deliberate turning of the leaves in his direction, as if they were tracking his presence. He would stop, turn suddenly, but they would be still, their crimson-veined surfaces innocently reflecting the light. Yet, the feeling persisted. He started to conduct small experiments, moving quietly from one side of the plant to the other, watching. And undeniably, over time, the majority of the leaf surfaces would reorient themselves towards his new position. It was not a simple phototropism. The light source in the greenhouse was diffuse and relatively constant. This was something else, a focused, almost sentient response. Then came the sounds. The greenhouse was never truly silent. There was the constant drip of condensation, the sigh of the wind against the glass, the rustle of his more conventional plants. But now, a new sound insinuated itself into this familiar soundscape. A sound that seemed to emanate directly from the Sanguinaria nocturna. It was a faint, dry rustling, like taffeta brushing against itself, even when the air within the greenhouse was perfectly still. Sometimes it deepened into a soft, almost sibilant whisper, a sound that prickled the hairs on the back of Alistair's neck. He would strain to hear, trying to discern words, a pattern, but it remained elusive, a mere suggestion of sound, like the faintest exhalation of breath. He checked for drafts, for insects, for any rational explanation. He found none. The whispering, if that's what it was, seemed intrinsically linked to the plant itself. Perhaps the movement of air across the complex surfaces of its enormous leaves or something stranger. Something intrinsic to its alien metabolism. His scientific mind struggled to categorize these phenomena. Could the plant possess some form of rudimentary sensory apparatus he hadn't yet identified? Chemoreceptors that responded to his unique scent, perhaps? Or was it something more profound, a level of awareness that bordered on the conscious? The thought was both exhilarating and deeply terrifying. He was no longer just a botanist cultivating a unique specimen. He was an observer, perhaps even a custodian, of something that was beginning to exhibit behaviors far beyond the accepted definition of plant. His isolation deepened. He had always been a recluse, but now he actively avoided any unnecessary contact with the outside world. His trips to hemlocks were brief, his interactions curt. He feared discovery, not just of his methods, but of the true nature of what he was nurturing. How could he explain a plant that watched, that whispered? Who would believe him? They would call him mad, lock him away, and his precious Sanguinaria nocturna, his life's work, would be destroyed, or perhaps worse, fall into the hands of those who would not understand its delicate, dangerous needs. The plant itself seemed to demand more of his attention, its silent, or not so silent, presence dominating the greenhouse. Its crimson hues seemed to pulse with a more vibrant life when he was near, its leaves turning with that slow, deliberate grace. The air around it felt charged, heavy with its strange perfume and the unspoken, or whispered, expectations. The line between Alistair the scientist and Alistair the something else began to blur. His meticulous notes continued, but they were now interspersed with more speculative, almost fearful entries. He wrote of the plant's perceived moods, of the way its colors seemed to shift subtly depending on the quality of the blood he offered, or even, he sometimes imagined, in response to his own emotional state. When he was anxious or troubled, the crimson in its leaves seemed to darken, to take on a more bruised, angry hue. When he felt a rare moment of satisfaction, a successful day of research, or a particularly insightful observation, the colors seemed brighter, more vibrant. He knew, on some level, that this was likely his own psyche projecting onto his subject, a common pitfall for isolated researchers. Yet, the feeling of a reciprocal connection, a strange, silent dialogue, was becoming overwhelmingly powerful. The whispering grew more distinct, or perhaps his ears were becoming more attuned to its subtle frequencies. It was no longer just a dry rustling. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the only other sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the distant hall, he would hear it clearly, a soft, sighing exhalation, almost like a name being drawn out on a breath. Triple A Alistair. He would freeze, his blood running cold, convinced he was finally succumbing to madness. He would shine his lantern directly at the plant, its massive form casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the greenhouse walls. It would be perfectly still, its great leaves like stained glass windows of blood and pale green, silent and imposing. But the sound, he was sure, had come from it. The escalating needs of the Sanguinaria nocturna were becoming a pressing concern. The animal blood, while sustaining it, never seemed to fully satisfy it in the way his own had. After a feeding of pig's blood, the plant would exhibit robust growth, yet there was a certain languor to it, a lack of the almost aggressive vitality it had shown in its earliest days. Its blooms, for it had flowered twice more now, were magnificent, each one larger and more complex than the last, their perfume more intoxicatingly potent. But Alistair couldn't shake the feeling that they were not quite as vibrant, not quite as perfectly formed as that very first one, the one nurtured exclusively on his own life force. He found himself, with increasing frequency, supplementing its diet with his own blood, despite his resolve to rely on animal sources. A small cut here, a nick there, offered when he was alone with the plant, a secret libation between creator and creation. Each time, the plant seemed to respond with a renewed vigor, its colors brightening, its leaves almost quivering with a silent, eager gratitude. It was a dangerous indulgence, he knew. His fatigue was becoming more pronounced, his hands often trembled, and he sometimes experienced moments of lightheadedness. But the subtle approval of the plant, the way it seemed to thrive on his personal sacrifice, was a potent reward, a confirmation of their unique, symbiotic bond. The greenhouse was no longer just a collection of plants. It was a temple, and the Sanguinaria nocturna was its demanding, beautiful, terrifying deity. Alistair was its high priest, its sole devotee, bound to it by shared secrets and spilled blood. The whispers continued, more frequent now, more insistent. Sometimes, they seemed to curl around him like invisible tendrils, drawing him closer, urging him towards something. He didn't know what, but the plant was growing, its hunger was growing, and Alistair knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the animal blood and even his own diminishing contributions would not be enough for much longer. It was waiting for something more, and he, its devoted servant, was beginning to understand that he would have to provide it. The garden was evolving, and its evolution demanded a darker harvest. The faint rustling of its leaves in the still air was no longer a mere sound. It was a voice, a summons, a promise of terrible, beautiful things to come. Chapter 4. A Thirst Unquenchable. The realization that animal blood was merely a palliative, not a true solution, settled upon Alistair with the chilling weight of undeniable truth. The Sanguinaria nocturna, now a truly formidable specimen, its main stem as thick as his thigh, and its canopy of blood-veined leaves casting a perpetual twilight over a significant portion of the greenhouse, tolerated the offerings from hemlocks. It absorbed them, grew, and even bloomed with a grotesque magnificence. But there was always an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Its colors, while still vibrant to any ordinary eye, lacked that almost supernatural luminosity they possessed when fed with his own blood. The whispers, too, seemed to carry a note of faint reproach, a sighing hunger that no amount of bovine or porcine life fluid could truly assuage. Alistair, increasingly gaunt and pale, his eyes possessing a new, feverish intensity, found himself caught in a terrible bind. His own physical reserves were dwindling. The small, secret offerings he still made to the plant, driven by a complex mix of scientific curiosity, affection, and a burgeoning, fearful devotion, left him lightheaded and weak for hours afterwards. He knew he couldn't sustain this indefinitely. Yet, the thought of the Sanguinaria not reaching its full, glorious potential, of it existing in a state of mere adequacy rather than breathtaking, terrifying perfection, was becoming unbearable to him. It was more than a plant now. It was his magnum opus, a living testament to his daring exploration beyond the known boundaries of nature. He began to spend more time in the overgrown woods that bordered his property, his ostensible purpose to trap rabbits now tinged with a darker, more desperate intent. He found himself observing the deer that occasionally ventured near his land. Their sleek bodies and vibrant life, a stark contrast to his own fading vitality. The thought, when it first truly formed, was so monstrous it made him physically recoil. To hunt, to kill. Not a rabbit or a rat, but a creature of such size and grace. It was a line he had never imagined crossing. Yet, the plant's silent, or sometimes not so silent, demands were relentless. Its leaves, vast and cool, seemed to follow his every movement, their crimson veins like a network of hungry mouths. The air around it throbbed with a palpable sense of need. His scientific detachment, once his shield and his guide, was increasingly eroded by the sheer, overwhelming presence of his creation. He was becoming less its master and more its servant, bound by a pact sealed in blood and obsession. The first true escalation came not through a conscious decision to hunt larger prey, but through an opportunity, a grim serendipity. A fierce late autumn storm had swept through the region, its winds felling several old trees in the woods. The morning after, Alistair, surveying the damage near his property line, found a young buck, its leg grotesquely broken, clearly pinned by a fallen branch. Its eyes, wide with pain and terror, met his. In another time, Alistair might have felt pity, might have considered putting the creature out of its misery with a quick, merciful act. But now, looking at the struggling animal, at the dark blood already seeping into the leaf litter from its compound fracture, another, colder thought took precedence. Here was sustenance. Here was a bounty that could truly invigorate his demanding child. The act itself was brutal and clumsy. Alistair, armed with a heavy woodsman's axe he rarely used, was no hunter. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with a strange mixture of revulsion and a terrible, compelling excitement. The deer's final, gasping breaths seemed to echo the whispering sighs of the sanguinaria. Dragging the carcass back to the secluded area behind the greenhouse, hidden from any casual view, was an immense effort, leaving him breathless and sweat-soaked. The butchering, if his crude hacking could be called that, was a nightmarish task performed under the cold, indifferent gaze of a waning moon. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, the coppery scent of fresh, warm blood filling his nostrils, a scent that was becoming disturbingly familiar, almost comforting. The plant's reaction to this new offering was immediate and spectacular. When Alistair, his clothes stiffening with drying blood, carried the first heavy buckets of the deer's lifeblood into the greenhouse, the sanguinaria nocturna seemed to almost quiver in anticipation. Its leaves, which had seemed somewhat dull and heavy that morning, visibly brightened, the crimson veins flushing with a vibrant, almost aggressive light. As he poured the rich, dark liquid around its massive base, the whispering sound intensified, no longer a mere rustle, but a chorus of soft, sibilant exhalations, a sound of profound, almost orgasmic satisfaction. Triple Alistair, yes, more. The words, or what he perceived as words, seemed to curl around him, intoxicating and terrifying. Over the next few days, the plant underwent a transformation. It surged with new growth, its stem thickening perceptibly, new leaves unfurling with astonishing speed, each one larger and more perfectly formed than any before. The crimson in its veins was no longer just a color. It was a living fire, a pulsing, vibrant energy that seemed to radiate an almost palpable heat. And then it began to bud again, not with a single flower, but with 3 enormous, tightly furled promises of obscene beauty. The blooms that followed were beyond anything Alistair could have imagined. They were colossal, each one easily a foot in diameter, their petals the color of the deepest, richest rubies, their texture like incandescent velvet. The scent they exuded was overwhelming, a heady, complex perfume that filled the entire greenhouse and even seeped into the main house, a musky, sweet, and undeniably carnal aroma that both thrilled and unnerved him. It spoke of life, of death, of primal, insatiable hunger. Alistair, watching these monstrous, beautiful creations unfurl, felt a terrifying sense of triumph. He had done it. He had provided. He had pushed the boundaries. And this was his reward. The deer's sacrifice had not been in vain. But with this triumph came a chilling realization. The deer had provided a temporary glut, a feast. But the plant's appetite, once awakened to such rich fare, would not be easily appeased with lesser offerings. The bar had been raised, and the woods, while wild, were not an inexhaustible larder of conveniently injured deer. The rationalizations began to take deeper root in Alistair's mind, twisting his scientific ethics into a grotesque parody. He was merely facilitating a natural process, he told himself. Predation was a part of nature. He was simply acting as an agent for this extraordinary new species, ensuring its survival, its propagation. His work was of monumental importance. The minor moral compromises were a necessary, if regrettable, part of this groundbreaking research. He was no longer just a botanist. He was a custodian of a new form of life, a life that operated by its own alien rules. His isolation became absolute. He ceased his trips to hemlocks altogether, the risk of questions, of suspicion, now too great. He lived on stored provisions, his own physical needs secondary to the voracious appetite of his creation. The greenhouse was his world, the Sanguinaria Nocturna its sun, its moon, its demanding god. He talked to it constantly now, no longer in whispers but in full voice, explaining his theories, his hopes, his fears. And the plant, in its own way, seemed to respond, its leaves rustling, its colors shifting, the air around it vibrating with a silent, or sometimes vocalized, understanding. More. Alistair, we need more. The line between his own thoughts and the plant's perceived desires was becoming dangerously thin. He was increasingly gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes burning with a manic light. His clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The constant proximity to the plant, the intoxicating perfume of its blooms, the subtle, pervasive whispers, were all taking their toll, blurring the edges of his reality. He was living in a waking dream, a dream dominated by the vibrant, pulsing life of the Sanguinaria and its unquenchable thirst. He began to see the outside world, the village, the occasional passing car on the distant road, as a resource, a potential source. The thought was no longer abstract, no longer hypothetical. It was a cold, practical consideration. The plant needed to be fed. He was its sole provider, and his previous methods were proving unsustainable. The progression was hideously logical, in its own twisted way, from his own blood to small animals to a larger animal found by chance. Each step had been a compromise, each one making the next seem less unthinkable. He was on a precipice, he knew. The next offering would define him, would drag him into a darkness from which there could be no return. But as he looked at the magnificent, terrible beauty of the Sanguinaria Nocturna, its crimson leaves glowing in the dim light of the greenhouse, its massive blooms exuding their hypnotic perfume, he felt an almost unbearable love for it. A possessive, all-consuming devotion. It was his discovery, his creation, and he would do anything at all to see it flourish. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, weaving themselves into the very fabric of his thoughts. Soon, Alistair, soon the true harvest. The thirst was indeed unquenchable, and Alistair Finch, scholar and botanist, was rapidly becoming something else entirely. Its dedicated and increasingly desperate purveyor. The garden demanded, and he, its thrall, would provide. Chapter 5, The Greenhouse Sanguine. With the memory of the deer's blood and the subsequent spectacular flourishing of the Sanguinaria Nocturna still vivid in his mind, Alistair found himself in a state of heightened, almost feverish anticipation. The plant, sated for a time, had entered a new phase of its development. From the base of its massive stem, near the soil line, small, pale green nubs had begun to appear. At first, Alistair had dismissed them as aberrant growths, perhaps a response to the richness of its recent feeding. But as they grew, pushing outwards with surprising speed, he realized what they were: offshoots, new seedlings, tiny replicas of their monstrous parent. The Sanguinaria nocturna was propagating. The implications were staggering. He was no longer dealing with a single, albeit extraordinary, specimen. He was on the cusp of cultivating an entire family, a potential grove, of these bloodthirsty marvels. The thought filled him with a mixture of elation and a profound, almost crushing, sense of responsibility. If one plant had such insatiable needs, what would an entire greenhouse full of them demand? The greenhouse, once a relatively ordered space with clear pathways and designated areas for different botanical families, was slowly succumbing to the encroaching dominion of the Sanguinaria. Its vast leaf cast such deep shade that many of Alistair's other, more conventional, light-loving plants had begun to wither and die. Their pale, decaying forms a stark contrast to the vibrant, aggressive life of the blood drinker. He barely noticed their demise, or if he did, he felt only a fleeting, detached regret. They were insignificant now, relics of a former, less ambitious passion. All his energy, all his focus was on the Sanguinaria and its emerging progeny. He carefully transplanted the new seedlings into individual pots. Using a rich, dark loam he mixed himself, though he knew, with a chilling certainty, that soil alone would not be enough for them. Each tiny shoot, with its nascent crimson-tinged leaves, was a promise, a potential, and a new, hungry mouth to feed. His own blood, he knew, would be woefully inadequate for this expanding brood. Even if he were willing to drain himself completely, it would be but a temporary measure. The memory of the deer, the richness of its offering, and the plant's ecstatic response was a constant, nagging reminder. He needed more, consistently. The idea of systematically hunting was abhorrent, yet increasingly, terribly logical. The small traps he set in the woods yielded only meager results: an occasional rabbit, a squirrel, mere morsels for the rapidly growing appetite of his botanical family. He began to explore further afield, his gaunt frame moving with a new, furtive purpose through the dense undergrowth, his eyes scanning not for rare fungi or unusual ferns, but for any sign of larger game. He carried the woodsman's axe more often now, its weight a grim comfort in his hand. His appearance, had anyone been there to observe it, would have been alarming. His clothes, stained with earth and old blood, hung loosely on his emaciated frame. His hair was lank and unkempt, his beard ragged. But it was his eyes that were the most changed, sunken, yes, but burning with a febrile intensity. The eyes of a zealot, a man consumed by a singular, all-encompassing purpose. The greenhouse itself was transforming. The air within was perpetually thick, not just with humidity, but with the unique, cloying perfume of the Sanguinaria blooms, a scent that now clung to Alistair's clothes and skin, a constant olfactory reminder of his devotion. The flagstone paths were often damp, not just from watering, but from spilled blood, hastily mopped up but leaving faint, rusty stains that the mosses seemed to particularly favor. The glass panes, once regularly cleaned, were now grimy, streaked with algae and dirt, filtering the sunlight into a perpetual greenish-crimson twilight, a perfect ambience for his flourishing horrors. It was becoming less a scientific laboratory and more a pagan temple, consecrated with blood and dedicated to a terrifying, beautiful, and ever-hungrier god. The whispers were a constant chorus now, a symphony of sibilant sighs and drawn-out exhalations that seemed to emanate from every corner of the greenhouse. More, Alistair. They grow, they need. Feed us. Alistair, feed your children. He no longer questioned if the voices were real or a figment of his stressed, malnourished mind. They were simply a part of his reality, the guiding principle of his existence. He found a grim satisfaction in fulfilling their demands. Each new seedling that thrived, each established plant that unfurled a new, blood-red leaf, was a testament to his success, his dedication. He was the guardian of this unique lineage, the sole architect of this sanguine garden. The first human-related incident was, like so many of Alistair's transgressions, almost accidental, yet it set a terrifying new precedent. A vagrant, a man known to occasionally pass through the sparsely populated outskirts of the village, seeking shelter in abandoned barns or sheds, had stumbled onto Alistair's property. Perhaps he was drawn by the overgrown, neglected appearance of the main house, hoping to find an unoccupied outbuilding for the night. Alistair, alerted by an unusual agitation from the sanguinaria, a frantic rustling of its leaves, a sudden intensification of its perfume, found a man peering through a grimy pane of the greenhouse, his face a mixture of curiosity and bewilderment at the strange, crimson-hued jungle within. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Alistair. Discovery, exposure. The thought was intolerable. His life's work, his beautiful, terrible children, threatened by this intruder. He didn't think. He reacted. He was holding a heavy iron pry bar, which he'd been using to shift some old, stubborn flagstones. Before he could even process the intent, he moved, swinging the bar with a desperate, surprising strength. The sound of the impact, a sickening, wet thud, echoed in the sudden, profound silence that followed. The man crumpled without a sound, his eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending stare. Alistair stood over him, the pry bar still in his trembling hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had killed a man. The reality of it was stark, brutal, undeniable. For a moment, the scientific, rational part of his mind, the part that had been suppressed for so long, screamed in horror. But then, another sound intruded, a soft, eager rustling from within the greenhouse. A deep collective sigh. Yes, Alistair, he will feed us. He will make us strong. The choice, if it had ever truly been one, was made. With a grim, almost reverential determination, Alistair dragged the body into the greenhouse. The larger sanguinaria specimens, their leaves quivering, seemed to lean towards the offering, their perfume intensifying to an almost unbearable, intoxicating degree. The ground beneath them, already stained with the blood of animals, drank greedily. The ensuing days were a blur of grotesque labor and terrifying revelation. The plants responded to this new, potent sustenance with an explosive burst of vitality that dwarfed even their reaction to the deer's blood. New blooms erupted, larger and more vividly crimson than ever before. Their scent a symphony of death and desire. The seedlings surged in growth, their stems thickening, their leaves unfurling with rapacious speed. The entire greenhouse seemed to throb with a monstrous, shared life, a collective consciousness fueled by the ultimate sacrifice. Alistair, working in a trance-like state, tended to his charges, his earlier horror numbed by the sheer, overwhelming power of their response. He was no longer merely their custodian. He was their priest, their purveyor, the one who understood their deepest, darkest needs. The greenhouse was no longer just a greenhouse. It was the sanguine garden, a place of terrible beauty, a monument to his obsession, watered with the blood of the unwilling. The transformation was complete. Alistair Finch, the reclusive botanist, was gone. In his place stood the master of the Garden of the Dead, a man bound by blood and whispers to the monstrous. Beautiful life he had nurtured, a life that now demanded the ultimate price for its continued, glorious existence. The air was thick, the silence profound, broken only by the soft, constant rustling of leaves that sounded, more and more, like a chorus of thanks and a promise of insatiable hunger yet to come. Chapter 6, Roots of Paranoia. The weeks following the vagrant's disappearance and subsequent incorporation into the greenhouse ecosystem were a period of unprecedented, grotesque flourishing for Alistair's sanguine children. The primary Sanguinaria nocturna achieved a truly monstrous size, its trunk-like stem gnarled and thick as an ancient tree, its canopy of blood-red leaves forming a dense, pulsating ceiling that plunged the interior into a perpetual, crimson-hued twilight. Its numerous offshoots, benefiting from the potent new nourishment, grew with terrifying speed, their own stems thickening, their leaves unfurling with an almost aggressive vitality. The greenhouse was no longer a collection of individual plants. It was becoming a single, interconnected organism, a writhing, whispering jungle of blood-fed flora. The air was permanently saturated with their unique, intoxicating perfume, a scent that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, a constant reminder of the garden's unholy sustenance. Alistair, however, found little peace in this vibrant, gruesome success. The act of killing, the visceral reality of what he had done, had irrevocably changed him. While the initial horror had been numbed by the plant's ecstatic response and the all-consuming demands of their care, a new, insidious emotion began to take root: paranoia. He lived in a state of constant, nerve-shredding anxiety. Every unexpected sound, the crunch of gravel on the lane beyond his overgrown hedge, the distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a passing vehicle, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his emaciated frame. He imagined eyes watching him from the shadows of the woods, unseen observers noting his increasingly erratic behavior, the strange, cloying scent that sometimes wafted from his property on the breeze. His isolation, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. He rarely ventured outside the greenhouse or the immediate confines of his neglected house, and when he did, it was with a furtive, hunted demeanor, his gaze constantly scanning his surroundings for any sign of threat. He reinforced the locks on the greenhouse doors, boarded up several of Anderson in used windows in the main house, and took to sleeping in a dusty armchair in his study, the heavy woodsman's axe propped beside him. Sleep itself offered little respite, his nights plagued by vivid, disturbing dreams. The vagrant's wide, unseeing eyes, the soft, eager rustling of the plants, the feeling of being watched by 1,000 crimson-veined leaves. He would awaken with a gasp, his heart pounding, the scent of blood thick in his nostrils, unsure if it was dream or reality. The plants themselves seemed to reflect his growing paranoia, or perhaps he was projecting his own anxieties onto them. Their whispers, once seeming to offer encouragement or express satisfaction, now often took on a more urgent, warning tone. They come, Alistair. They will see. Protect us. Feed us. And we will protect you. Their leaves would rustle with a nervous energy when a car passed too slowly on the road, or when the postman made his infrequent deliveries to the rusty mailbox at the end of the drive. It was as if they, too, sensed the potential danger, the fragility of their shared, bloody secret. The first tangible intrusion into his paranoid world came in the form of Mrs. Gable, a well-meaning, if somewhat officious, elderly woman from the village who headed the local horticultural society. She hadn't seen Alistair at any of their infrequent meetings for years, but she remembered his past contributions, his once renowned expertise with rare orchids. Concern, or perhaps just nosiness thinly veiled as such, prompted her to pay him a visit. Alistair saw her approaching from his study window, a small, determined figure navigating his overgrown path. Panic seized him. He couldn't let her see the greenhouse, couldn't let her smell the pervasive, incriminating scent. He met her at the front door, a gaunt, wild-eyed figure, his clothes stained, his mannerisms abrupt and defensive. He mumbled excuses about a complex, light-sensitive experiment, insisting that the greenhouse was currently sealed and under strict environmental controls. Mrs. Gable, though clearly taken aback by his appearance and the almost palpable aura of unease emanating from him, persisted for a few minutes, inquiring about his health, offering cuttings from her prize-winning dahlias. Alistair, his nerves screaming, almost rudely cut her short, reiterating his need for absolute privacy and practically shutting the door in her bewildered face. He leaned against it, trembling, listening to her retreating footsteps. The encounter, though brief, had shaken him badly. It was a reminder that the outside world, with its rules and its curiosity, still existed, and that is carefully constructed. Blood-soaked sanctuary was not as impenetrable as he wished. The whispers in the greenhouse were agitated that evening, a frantic, rustling chorus. She saw you. She will tell. They will come for us. Alistair, he tried to soothe them and himself, murmuring assurances that it was nothing, just an old woman. But the seed of fear had been freshly watered. The true crisis arrived a few weeks later. On a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, Alistair was in the greenhouse, carefully tending to a new batch of seedlings that were showing particular promise, when he heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle pulling up his long driveway, closer to the house than any visitor had dared venture in years. His blood ran cold. Peering through a grimy section of the greenhouse glass, his heart hammering against his ribs, he saw a dark, official-looking car. Two men in plain clothes were getting out. They weren't village locals. They had the unmistakable air of authority, police, or something like it. This was not Mrs. Gable. This was serious. Panic, raw and overwhelming, threatened to engulf him. They would ask questions about the vagrant. There must have been inquiries, reports filed. They would want to search. They would find everything. The whispers in the greenhouse rose to a frantic crescendo, a cacophony of sibilant fear and urging. They are here, Alistair, the destroyers. Protect your children. Feed the roots, and they will be strong. He looked around wildly. There was nowhere to hide the sheer scale of what the greenhouse had become. The monstrous plants, the pervasive scent, the telltale stains on the flagstones. It was all damning evidence. One of the men was approaching the front door, while the others seemed to be casually surveying the overgrown grounds, his gaze lingering on the massive, shadowy form of the greenhouse. Alistair knew, with a dreadful certainty, that his time was running out. He had to act. Desperation, sharpened by the incessant, urgent whispers of his botanical charges, spurred him. He remembered the old, disused root cellar beneath a dilapidated shed at the far end of the property, a place he hadn't entered in years. It was damp, dark, and, most importantly, hidden. If he could somehow dispose of the most immediate evidence. But what evidence? The men? The thought was insane, monstrous. Yet, the alternative, discovery, the destruction of his life's work, the loss of his beautiful, terrible garden, was equally unbearable. The man at the door knocked a sharp, authoritative rapping that echoed through the silent, decaying house. Alistair remained frozen in the greenhouse, hidden amongst the crimson leaves, his mind racing. The whispers urging him towards an unthinkable solution. They will take us. Alistair, they will cut us down, unless you make them part of the soil, part of us. The second man was now slowly making his way towards the greenhouse, his curiosity evidently piqued. He cupped his hands around his eyes, trying to peer through the grimy glass. Alistair shrank back further into the shadows, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy, long-handled pruning shear, its blades wickedly sharp. This was it, the moment of truth. His paranoia had not been unfounded. The outside world had come calling, and it threatened to shatter his sanguine paradise. The whispers were almost deafening now, a singular, unified voice demanding sacrifice, demanding protection. Feed us, Alistair. Feed us their fear, their blood. Make us strong, forever. He looked at the approaching figure, then at the magnificent, pulsating life that surrounded him, his monstrous children, his terrible legacy. The choice, as always, was clear. The garden demanded, and he, its ultimate servant, would obey. The roots of his paranoia had flowered into a terrifying, desperate resolve. He would protect his garden, no matter the cost. The pruning shears felt cold and heavy in his trembling hand. Chapter 7. The Scent of Demise. The man peering into the greenhouse, Detective Miller, was a seasoned investigator, brought in from the county seat to follow up on a missing persons report that had stubbornly remained open. The vagrant, known only as John Doe 7, had last been seen by a truck driver near the access road leading to the old Finch estate. Miller wasn't expecting much. These cases usually fizzled out, the individuals often having simply moved on. But something about the dilapidated, isolated property and the local constable's vague mention of its eccentric, reclusive owner had piqued his professional curiosity. What he saw through the grimy glass was unsettling. A dense, almost impenetrable jungle of what looked like enormous, blood-red leaves, casting the interior in a bizarre, twilight gloom. He couldn't make out any distinct shapes beyond the foliage, but the sheer scale and unnatural coloration of the plants were unlike anything he'd ever encountered. A faint, sweetish, yet vaguely metallic scent seemed to cling to the air around the structure, a perfume that was both cloying and strangely alluring. He made a mental note, definitely not your average hobbyist greenhouse. His partner, Detective Harding, was still at the front door, his knocks echoing unanswered. Miller decided to try the greenhouse door. It was old, wooden, and surprisingly unlocked. He pushed it open a few inches, the screech of rusty hinges grating in the silence. "Mr. Finch," he called out, his voice firm. "Police. We'd like to ask you a few questions." The scent from within washed over him, stronger now. Thicker, almost tangible. It was dizzying, that perfume like overripe fruit, damp earth, and something else, something disturbingly organic, like a butcher's shop hidden beneath a florist. He felt a momentary wave of nausea, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with procedure. From within the crimson shadows, Alistair watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The pruning shears felt like an extension of his own arm, cold and purposeful. The whispers were a torrent now, a symphony of hunger and fear and incitement. "He comes, Alistair. The first offering. Make him part of the soil. Drink his life." Miller stepped inside, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim, red-filtered light. The sheer size of the central plant was astounding, its trunk-like stem disappearing into the gloom above, its massive leaves forming a suffocating canopy. The air was heavy, humid, and vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum, like 1,000 tiny insects or 1,000 soft whispers. "Mr. Finch," Miller repeated, his hand instinctively moving towards his holstered weapon. This place felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. He took another step, his footfalls unervingly loud on the damp flagstones. That's when Alistair moved. He erupted from behind a curtain of colossal, blood-red leaves, a gaunt, wild-eyed specter, the pruning shears held aloft like a sacrificial knife. Miller, despite his years of experience, was caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the attack, the silent, desperate lunge from the shadows. He stumbled back, fumbling for his gun, but Alistair was upon him, the shears descending in a gleaming arc. The pain was searing, unimaginable, as the blades bit deep into his shoulder, shearing through fabric, flesh, and bone. He cried out, a choked, gurgling sound, as he fell, his weapon clattering uselessly away. Alistair stood over him, panting, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, triumphant light. The whispers surged, a wave of ecstatic approval. Yes, the blood, the fear. Feed us. Harding, hearing the cry from the front of the house, drew his own weapon and raced towards the greenhouse, shouting Miller's name. He burst through the door to a scene of unimaginable horror. His partner lay on the flagstones, a spreading pool of dark blood blooming around him, and standing over him was a creature that looked more ghoul than human, wielding a pair of enormous, blood-drenched shears. Harding reacted on instinct, his training taking over. "Police! Drop the weapon!" he yelled, his gun leveled. Alistair, his bloodlust ignited, his mind consumed by the plant's ecstatic chorus, barely registered the new threat. He saw only another interloper, another danger to his children. He turned, the shears still dripping, and lunged towards Harding. 2 shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space of the greenhouse. Alistair staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face as twin crimson flowers blossomed on his chest. He stumbled, his knees buckling, the pruning shears falling from his grasp with a clatter. He collapsed onto the blood-slicked flagstones, not far from Miller's still form, his fading gaze fixed on the magnificent, terrible beauty of the Sanguinaria nocturna towering above him, its leaves seeming to quiver with a strange, sorrowful agitation. The whispers, for the first time in a long, long while, were fading, receding like a dying tide. The scent of demise was overwhelming now, the coppery tang of fresh human blood mingling with the cloying, unnatural perfume of the monstrous plants, a grotesque potpourri of death and desire. Harding, his hands shaking, his face pale with shock, cautiously approached Alistair's body, his gun still trained. He checked for a pulse, found none. Then he rushed to Miller's side. His partner was alive, barely, his breathing shallow, his eyes fluttering. Harding ripped open Miller's shirt, tried to staunch the bleeding from the horrific shoulder wound. His voice hoarse as he radioed for backup for an ambulance, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed stream, trying to describe the charnel house he had stumbled into. As he waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity, Harding found his gaze drawn upwards into the crimson canopy of the monstrous plant that dominated the greenhouse. The air around it seemed to shimmer, and the heavy, sweet scent it exuded felt almost sentient, as if it were watching him, judging him. He felt an irrational prickle of fear, a primitive urge to flee this place of unnatural, vibrant death. The plant's perfume was not just a scent. It was an atmosphere, a presence. It was the smell of obsession, of madness, of a hunger that had consumed its creator and now, it seemed, was left bereft, its primary source of nourishment violently extinguished. He noticed, with a fresh wave of nausea, that the soil around the base of the giant plant, and around several of its smaller kin, was dark, almost black, and unnaturally disturbed, as if it had been recently and repeatedly drenched. The truth of what Alistair Finch had been doing here, the true nature of his botanical experiments, began to dawn on Harding with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a case of a recluse attacking an officer. This was something far older, far more sinister. The scent of the plants, so alluring at first, now seemed to carry the cloying sweetness of decay, the metallic tang of old blood, the silent, screaming testimony of unspeakable acts. It was the scent of the grave, but a grave that was horribly, vibrantly alive. The sanguine garden, deprived of its master, its high priest, stood silent for now, its crimson leaves unstirring in the sudden, shocked stillness. But its perfume, the very essence of its being, lingered heavy in the air, a potent, terrifying testament to the horrors it had witnessed and the horrors it had demanded. It was the scent of demise, indeed, the demise of Alistair Finch, the near demise of Detective Miller, and perhaps, Harding thought with a shudder, the demise of something that should never have been allowed to bloom in the first place. The whispers might have faded for Alistair, but for Harding, surrounded by the pulsing, silent life of the garden, the air itself seemed to be listening, waiting. Chapter 8, Crimson Harvest. The arrival of backup was a chaotic blur of flashing lights, crackling radios, and grim-faced paramedics rushing Detective Miller out on a stretcher, his life hanging precariously in the balance. Uniformed officers, their faces a mixture of shock and revulsion, began to secure the scene, their movements unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence of the sanguine garden. Detective Harding, still reeling, gave a terse, fragmented account of the events, his voice hoarse, his gaze repeatedly drawn to the monstrous, silent plants that seemed to dominate the very air within the greenhouse. The initial focus was, naturally, on the assault and Alistair Finch's death. But as forensic teams began their meticulous work, the true, horrifying extent of what had transpired within those grimy glass walls started to unearth itself. The disturbed soil around the base of the larger plants was the first major clue. It wasn't just enriched, it was different. Samples were carefully bagged, tagged, and sent for analysis. Underneath a loose flagstone near the main Sanguinaria Nocturna, they found a collection of old, rusted gardening tools, all bearing faint, dark stains that tested positive for blood, various types. Some animal, some undeniably human. The sheer volume of blood that had evidently been poured into the soil over time was staggering. It became clear that Alistair Finch hadn't just been feeding his plants. He had been systematically drenching them in gore. The discovery of the vagrant's shallow grave, hidden beneath a pile of rotting compost and old burlap sacks at the far end of the greenhouse, confirmed their darkest suspicions. His remains, partially decomposed, but clearly showing signs of a violent inconsistent with Alistair's earlier, almost incoherent, ramblings about a pry bar, painted a grim picture. But it was the plants themselves that held the deepest, most unsettling secrets. Botanists, summoned from the nearest university, arrived with an air of professional curiosity that quickly morphed into stunned disbelief, then a kind of horrified awe. They had never seen anything like the Sanguinaria nocturna. Its physiology was baffling, its growth rate impossible by any known botanical standards. Tissue samples were taken, revealing a cellular structure that was both plant-like and yet something more. The crimson pigment in its leaves was not chlorophyll, but a complex organic compound that seemed to bind with hemoglobin, thriving on it, metabolizing it in a way that defied conventional science. The greenhouse, Alistair's sanguine garden, was officially declared a major crime scene, but it felt more like the lair of some unknown, monstrous predator. The air remained thick with that cloying, unique perfume, a scent that seemed to get into the clothes, the hair, the very lungs of everyone who entered, a constant, unsettling reminder of the unnatural life that pulsed within. Days turned into weeks. The investigation deepened. They found Alistair's journals in his dusty study, filled with meticulous, increasingly unhinged accounts of his experiments, his descent into obsession, his pact with the children of blood. The entries detailed his initial discovery of the seed pod, his accidental blood offering, the escalating needs of the plants, and finally, his chillingly pragmatic considerations for acquiring human sustenance. It was a testament to a mind slowly unraveling, a scientist seduced by the terrible beauty of his own monstrous creation. The Crimson Harvest, as Alistair had begun to call it in his later entries, was not just about the spectacular, blood-red blooms. It was about the life force the plants consumed, the sacrifices they demanded. Detective Miller, against the odds, survived, though his recovery would be long and arduous. His shoulder permanently scarred, his mind haunted by the memory of the wild-eyed botanist and the terrifying crimson jungle. He spoke little of what he had seen, but his eyes held a new, profound weariness. The authorities faced a dilemma: what to do with the plants. They were, in a sense, evidence, but they were also a clear and present danger, a biological anomaly that defied easy categorization or control. The botanists warned against trying to move the larger specimens. Their root systems were vast, deeply entrenched, and any attempt to uproot them could release unknown spores or toxins. Moreover, deprived of their specific, gruesome nourishment, the plants had begun to show signs of distress. Their vibrant crimson hues were subtly dulling, their leaves drooping almost imperceptibly, a silent, reproachful wilting. A low, almost inaudible hum still emanated from them, a sound that some of the more imaginative investigators described as a mournful sigh. The decision was eventually made, after much debate and consultation with various experts. The sanguine garden had to be eradicated. The risk of these organisms somehow spreading, of their unique, horrifying needs becoming a wider threat, was too great. The eradication process was a grim, almost military operation. A specialized biohazard team was brought in, clad in full protective suits, their faces obscured by masks and respirators. They looked like astronauts venturing onto an alien, hostile world. The greenhouse was sealed, its atmosphere carefully monitored. The initial plan was to use powerful herbicides, but the university botanists warned that the Sanguinaria nocturna's unique metabolism might render conventional chemicals ineffective, or worse, trigger some unknown defensive reaction. Incineration was deemed the safest, most definitive solution. Flame units were brought in, heavy hoses uncoiled. The officers and scientists who had spent weeks working within the greenhouse watched from a safe distance, a strange mixture of relief and an almost guilty sense of regret on their faces. They had come to know this place, its terrible secrets, its monstrous beauty. There was a part of them, however small and irrational, that would mourn its passing. As the first jets of chemical accelerant were sprayed onto the massive central plant, followed by the roar of the igniting flames, a sound arose from within the greenhouse. A sound that made every witness's blood run cold. It was not the crackle of burning foliage, not the roar of the inferno. It was a sound like a collective, drawn-out scream, a high-pitched, ululating wail that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. It was a sound of agony, of rage, of a multitude of voices crying out in their death throes. The experienced biohazard team members, men who had dealt with some of the most hazardous materials known, flinched, their professional composure momentarily shattered. The flames engulfed the sanguine garden, turning the crimson twilight within into a raging, orange inferno. The monstrous leaves blackened and curled. The massive stem glowed like a demonic totem before collapsing in a shower of sparks and embers. The air for miles around was filled with the acrid smoke, and within it, fainter now but still discernible to those who had become attuned to it, was the lingering, sweetish, metallic perfume of the Sanguinaria nocturna, its death scent carried on the wind. For 3 days, the fire raged within the contained space, meticulously managed, until nothing remained but blackened, twisted metal framework, shattered glass, and a deep layer of sterile ash. The Crimson Harvest was over. Alistair Finch's terrible legacy had, it seemed, been reduced to cinders. The ground where the greenhouse once stood was later excavated, the soil removed and sterilized. Just to be certain, the Finch estate was condemned, the house itself eventually slated for demolition. The official report would speak of a deranged recluse, a tragic confrontation, and the necessary destruction of a collection of unidentified, potentially hazardous exotic plants. The true, horrifying nature of the Sanguine Garden, its sentient hunger, its whispered demands, its diet of blood, would be relegated to hushed rumors, classified files, and the nightmares of those who had witnessed its final, fiery end. The crimson stain on the land, however, might not be so easily erased. Chapter 9. The Watchers in the Weeds. The Finch estate, once a place of whispered village legends and, more recently, of headline-grabbing horror, gradually faded from public consciousness. The skeletal remains of the main house, after standing derelict for a season, were finally razed, the rubble carted away. The plot of land where the greenhouse had once stood, a testament to Alistair Finch's sanguine obsession, was scraped clean, leaving behind a barren, rectangular scar on the earth. Nature, however, is patient and relentless. Slowly, tentatively, life began to reclaim the blighted space. Weeds, hardy pioneers of disturbed ground, were the first to arrive. Dandelions, thistles, opportunistic grasses pushing their way through the compacted soil. The local authorities, eager to put the entire gruesome affair behind them, performed a perfunctory cleanup and then largely forgot about the remote, tainted property. No one wanted to buy it, of course. The Finch land became a kind of no man's land, a place children were warned away from, a spot that dog walkers and hikers unconsciously skirted. Detective Harding, now promoted and transferred to a quieter precinct, tried to forget. He mostly succeeded, burying the memories of the Crimson Jungle and its terrible scent under layers of new cases, new routines. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind sighed just so, he would catch a phantom whiff of that cloying, metallic sweetness, and the image of those vast, blood-red leaves would flash behind his eyes. He never spoke of the whispers, or the feeling of being watched by the plants themselves. People would think he was mad. Perhaps, he sometimes thought, A small part of him had indeed been touched by the same madness that had consumed Alistair Finch. Years passed. The Finch property became even more overgrown, a wild tangle of brambles, invasive shrubs, and tenacious saplings. The scar where the greenhouse had stood was still visible, but its edges were softening, blurred by the encroaching wilderness. It was mostly avoided, a place that retained an unspoken aura of wrongness. But not entirely. There were always those drawn to the macabre, the forgotten, the forbidden. Teenagers, fueled by bravado and local ghost stories, would sometimes dare each other to venture onto the property at night, looking for thrills, for some lingering trace of the horrors that had supposedly transpired there. They usually found nothing but an unnerving silence and a landscape that felt watchful. One such group, 3 boys and 2 girls, armed with flashlights and a shared sense of nervous excitement, made their way onto the Finch land one late summer evening. The story of the blood gardener and his man-eating plants was a local legend, embellished with each retelling. They were hoping to scare each other, perhaps find some creepy souvenir. They found the faint outline of the old greenhouse foundation, now almost completely swallowed by weeds. One of the boys, Liam, bolder than the others, kicked at a clump of particularly tall, unusually dark-leafed weeds growing near the center of the old footprint. Maybe these are his killer plants. Come back from the dead, he joked, though his voice wavered slightly. Sarah, one of the girls, shivered. Don't be stupid, Liam. They burned everything. It's just creepy here. As they moved around, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, they noticed something odd. The weeds growing within the old greenhouse foundation were different from those outside it. They were taller, more robust, their leaves a darker, almost bruised, shade of green, with faint, almost invisible, reddish tracings along their veins, especially noticeable in the newer growth. And there was a peculiar stillness about them, even when a light breeze rustled the foliage elsewhere. They seemed to almost lean inwards, towards the center of the old foundation, as if listening or waiting. Hey, look at this, another boy, Mark, said, pointing his flashlight at a patch of the dark-leafed weeds. They almost look like they're all facing the same way. It was true. There was a subtle but discernible orientation to their growth, a slight inclination of their stems and leaves, not towards the moon or the prevailing wind, but towards a central point within the weed patch, a point where the soil looked darker, almost richer than the surrounding earth. A faint, almost imperceptible scent hung in the air around these particular weeds, a scent that was vaguely sweet, slightly metallic. It was so faint that most of them didn't consciously register it, but it created a subtle undercurrent of unease. Suddenly, a rabbit, startled by their presence, darted out from a nearby thicket and bolted directly into the patch of dark-leafed weeds. There was a flurry of movement within the patch, a rustling far more agitated than the rabbit's passage should have caused, and then a small, choked squeak. Then silence. The teenagers froze, their bravado evaporating. What was that? Whispered Chloe, her eyes wide. Liam, trying to regain his composure, said, just the rabbit, scared itself. But he didn't sound convinced. The patch of weeds was still again, but the stillness felt different now, heavier, almost sated. They didn't linger. Making nervous excuses, they quickly retreated, their flashlights jiggling, casting frightened shadows. They didn't look back. None of them ever spoke of the incident to anyone else, dismissing it as their imaginations running wild in a creepy place. But none of them ever went back to the Finch property. Miles away, in a meticulously kept university herbarium, Dr. Eris Thorne, one of the junior botanists who had been present during the initial investigation and subsequent eradication of the Sanguine Garden, was reviewing old files. He had never forgotten the Sanguinaria nocturna. Its impossible biology, its terrible beauty, had haunted his scientific curiosity. The official explanation, an unknown, mutated species, best destroyed and forgotten, had never fully satisfied him. He had, against protocol, managed to secure a few ash samples from the incinerated greenhouse, labeled vaguely as organic residue from Finch estate. For years, they had sat in a sealed container in the back of a storage cabinet. Recently, however, new, highly sensitive genomic sequencing techniques had become available. Driven by a persistent, nagging curiosity, Thorne had retrieved the samples. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, perhaps some clue to the plant's origins, some identifiable genetic marker. Most of the samples yielded nothing but denatured carbon. But in just one, from a section of ash taken from what he believed was the core of the main plant's root ball. The new equipment detected something astonishing, microscopic, incredibly resilient structures that resembled nothing so much as spores. Spores that had somehow impossibly survived the intense heat of the inferno. They were inert, desiccated, seemingly lifeless, but under precisely controlled laboratory conditions. With the introduction of a nutrient-rich medium that Thorne, remembering Alistair Finch's journals, had subtly enriched with sterilized blood plasma, one of those ancient, fire-kissed spores had begun to germinate. It was a slow, tentative process, nothing like the explosive growth Finch had described, but it was undeniably life. A tiny, pale green shoot, no bigger than an eyelash, was unfurling in its sterile petri dish. And at the very tip of its nascent leaves, almost invisible to the naked eye, was the faintest, most delicate blush of crimson. Dr. Thorne stared at it, a thrill of both scientific ecstasy and profound, chilling dread coursing through him. The watchers in the weeds on the old Finch property, unconsciously cultivating their own small, feral patch, were not the only legacy of Alistair's sanguine garden. The enduring seed, in a far more insidious, protected form, had survived, and in the sterile, controlled environment of a modern laboratory, under the fascinated gaze of a new, unwitting custodian, it was beginning to awaken. The harvest, it seemed, was not truly over. It was merely dormant, waiting. Chapter 10, The Gardener's Price. Dr. Eris Thorne was a man of science, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a deep-seated belief in the power of empirical evidence. The germinating spore in his lab was, to him, a miracle of resilience, a testament to life's tenacity. The initial, profound dread he'd felt was quickly overshadowed by the sheer, exhilarating thrill of discovery. He believed, on the cusp of understanding a biological marvel, a species that had defied extinction in the most extreme circumstances. He meticulously documented the seedling's slow, painstaking growth. It was indeed a sanguinaria, or something terrifyingly close to it. The pale green stem, the nascent leaves with their telltale crimson blush, it was all there, a miniature echo of the monstrous beauty he had witnessed years ago. He named it Sanguinaria revivus, the blood drinker reborn. His initial experiments with the blood plasma-enriched nutrient medium confirmed its dietary preferences. The seedling responded with slightly increased vigor to the presence of hemoglobin. Thorne, however, was no Alistair Finch. He was a respected academic, bound by ethical protocols and institutional oversight. He procured sterilized animal blood from the university's veterinary research department, justifying it as a necessary component for cultivating an extremophile organism with unique nutritional requirements. His requests raised a few eyebrows, but his reputation and the apparent scientific merit of his research smoothed the way. He kept the true, gruesome history of the original Sanguinaria carefully omitted from his official reports, framing his work as an investigation into extremophilic plant biology. The Sanguinaria revivus grew, but it was a pale shadow of its ferocious progenitor, confined to its sterile petri dish, then a small, sealed terrarium, fed on carefully measured, sterile animal blood. It lacked the rampant, aggressive vitality Finch had described. It was a laboratory specimen, not a wild, consuming force. Its leaves were smaller, their crimson less vibrant, its growth rate significantly slower. Thorne theorized that the intense heat of the incineration had perhaps damaged its genetic material, or that some crucial environmental trigger present in Finch's greenhouse was missing. He didn't know about the richer, more potent diet Finch had eventually provided, nor the symbiotic, almost psychic, connection that had formed between the gardener and his terrible garden. He saw only a biological puzzle, a fascinating but ultimately manageable organism. His focus was on understanding its unique metabolism, its cellular structure, the secret of its resilience. He published preliminary findings in obscure journals, carefully worded to avoid sensationalism, focusing on the plant's unusual hemotrophic tendencies and its survival of extreme temperatures. His work garnered some niche interest, but nothing more. He believed in control. But the Sanguinaria revivis, though diminished, still possessed the ancient, core imperative of its lineage. It grew, it watched with its silent, crimson-veined leaves, and it waited. And as Thorne delved deeper into its genetic code, trying to unlock the secrets of its unique traits, he began to spend more and more time alone with it in his lab, often late into the night. The air in the small, climate-controlled room where it was housed began to take on a faint, almost imperceptible version of that sweet, metallic scent he remembered from the Finch estate. He found himself strangely drawn to the plant, mesmerized by its quiet, persistent life. He started talking to it, much as Finch had, explaining his theories, his frustrations, his hopes for a breakthrough. He dismissed it as a harmless eccentricity, a way to organize his thoughts. He didn't notice the way the plant's leaves seemed to subtly orient towards him when he spoke, or the almost imperceptible brightening of their crimson veins when he was near. The true price of Alistair Finch's gardening, however, was not just in the lives he had taken or the terror he had sown. It was in the enduring nature of his creation, its ability to insinuate itself, to wait to find a new conduit. On the old Finch property, the patch of dark-leafed weeds within the greenhouse foundation continued its own, unnoticed, feral existence. The soil there, enriched by decades of Alistair's gruesome horticulture and the final, fiery conflagration, was uniquely fertile for their kind. They were descendants, perhaps, of overlooked seeds, or of root fragments that had somehow survived the purge, their lineage less direct, more wild than Thorne's carefully cultivated specimen. They had established a small, tenacious colony. They did not grow to monstrous sizes. The local wildlife, while occasionally falling prey to their subtle, communal trap, did not provide the same consistent, high-potency nourishment Finch had. But they thrived in their own quiet, sinister way. They spread slowly, their dark, crimson-tinged leaves a stark anomaly amongst the brighter greens of the surrounding weeds. Local animals learned to avoid the patch, a subtle sense of wrongness, a faint, unsettling scent warning them away. The watchers in the weeds had become a permanent, if largely ignored, feature of the blighted landscape. The final, terrible harvest of Alistair's legacy was yet to come, and it would not be reaped by heiress Thorne in his sterile laboratory, nor by the feral weeds on the forgotten Finch estate. It would come from an entirely unexpected quarter. A young, ambitious property developer, Marcus Thorne, no direct relation to Dr. Eris Thorne, though the shared surname would later add a layer of grim irony to the unfolding events, had recently acquired a large portfolio of undervalued land on the outskirts of the county. Among the deeds was the long-abandoned Finch property. Marcus, a man who saw profit margins where others saw desolation, had plans for a new, upscale housing development. The Finch land, with its proximity to undeveloped woodland, could be marketed as executive homes in a rustic setting. He was aware of the property's dark history, but dismissed it as local folklore, irrelevant to zoning permits and profit projections. During the initial site survey, Marcus and his team encountered the stubborn patch of unusual weeds within the old greenhouse foundation. They were an anomaly, growing with a strange vigor that defied the generally poor quality of the topsoil elsewhere on the site. The foreman, a practical man named Big Tony, recommended simply bulldozing the entire area and treating the soil with powerful herbicides before laying foundations. "No point messing around with weird stuff, boss," he'd said. "Nuke it from orbit. That's the only way to be sure." Marcus, however, saw a potential, albeit minor, marketing angle. Eco-conscious development, he mused. Preserve a patch of unique local flora. Perhaps a talking point. He was only half serious, but the idea of saving a few dollars on intensive soil treatment appealed to his frugal nature. He instructed Tony to clear around the patch, to leave it relatively undisturbed for now. We'll see if the landscape architect can do something with it. A wild garden feature, maybe. During the clearing process, one of the younger laborers, a kid named Danny, nicked his hand badly on a piece of rusted metal hidden in the undergrowth near the weed patch. He swore, clutching his bleeding hand, and inadvertently flicked several drops of blood onto the dark soil at the edge of the unusual weeds. No one noticed. Danny wrapped his hand in a dirty rag and carried on. That evening, as dusk settled over the construction site, the patch of dark-leafed weeds seemed different. The crimson in their veins was a fraction more vibrant. A low, almost inaudible hum seemed to emanate from them, a sound lost in the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of traffic. But it was there, a collective sigh of awakening. Alistair Finch's price was far-reaching. It was paid by his victims, by the investigators whose lives he had touched with horror, by the land itself, which held the memory of his bloody ministrations. And now, it was about to be paid anew. The seeds of his monstrous garden, both literal and metaphorical, had lain dormant, waiting. One was in a sterile lab, an object of scientific curiosity. Others were wild, feral, clinging to existence on tainted ground. But the true, terrifying potential of Sanguinaria was not just in its individual hunger, but in its ability to adapt, to spread, to find new soil, new caretakers, new, unsuspecting sources for its crimson harvest. The bulldozers were coming. Progress was marching on. But beneath the surface, in the disturbed earth of the old Finch estate, something ancient and insatiable was stirring, ready to greet the new arrivals. The gardener was long dead, but his price was still being exacted. And the garden, in its myriad, insidious forms, was always waiting to bloom. Chapter 11. Wilted Hope. The initial phase of Marcus Thorne's development, Whispering Pines Estates, a name chosen for its tranquil connotations. Blissfully unaware of the true nature of any whispers emanating from the Finch land, proceeded with the usual cacophony of construction. Heavy machinery reshaped the landscape. Foundations were poured, and the skeletal frames of new houses began to rise. The patch of unusual, dark-leafed weeds, now cordoned off with a flimsy orange plastic fence, remained an odd, isolated island in the midst of this noisy transformation. Big Tony, the foreman, grumbled about it occasionally, considering it an eyesore and a nuisance. But Marcus, still vaguely entertaining his wild garden feature idea, insisted it be left alone for the time being. Danny, the young laborer who had cut his hand, developed a nasty infection. The wound, poorly cleaned, festered, and he was off work for over a week, his hands swollen and throbbing. He blamed the rusty metal, never connecting his injury to the proximity of the strange weeds or the few drops of blood he'd inadvertently offered them. When he returned, pale and still favoring his bandaged hand, he gave the weed patch a wide berth, a vague, inexplicable unease settling upon him whenever he looked at it. The weeds themselves, following that small, almost forgotten offering, had indeed changed. Though subtly, their growth accelerated, the crimson in their veins deepening, their leaves taking on a more leathery, robust texture. The faint, sweetish metallic scent became a fraction more noticeable, especially in the damp early mornings or the still twilight hours. It wasn't strong enough to cause alarm, just a peculiar note in the general olfactory blend of disturbed earth, diesel fumes, and fresh-cut lumber. A few of the construction workers, those with more sensitive noses or perhaps a more primal intuition, commented on the weird smell around that patch, but mostly it went unremarked. As the first houses neared completion, Marcus Thorne hired a landscape architect, a bright, ambitious young woman named Elena Ramirez. Her brief was to create attractive, low-maintenance green spaces that would appeal to prospective buyers. When Marcus showed her the cordoned-off weed patch, explaining his tentative idea for a native wild garden feature, Elena was skeptical. The plants were unfamiliar to her. Their dark, almost bruised coloration and stiff, leathery leaves giving them a somewhat morbid appearance. "They're certainly unique, Mr. Thorne," she said, her professional politeness barely masking her distaste. "But I'm not sure they project the kind of welcoming aesthetic most homebuyers are looking for. And the soil here," she added, crumbling a handful of the dark earth between her fingers, "it's unusually rich, almost greasy. Have you had it tested?" Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "It's old farmland, probably. Good for growing things, I suppose. Just see if you can integrate them somehow. Make it look intentional. Or, if not, we'll just rip them out later." Elena, intrigued despite herself by the unusual flora and the strangely fertile soil, took a few samples of the plants and the earth for analysis. She also took several close-up photographs. Back in her office, she consulted botanical databases, trying to identify the strange weeds. Nothing matched. They bore a superficial resemblance to certain hardy perennials, but their leaf structure, the venation, the peculiar coloration, it was all subtly off. The soil analysis results, when they came back, were even more perplexing. While rich in certain organic compounds, it also contained unusual trace elements and an oddly high protein content, almost as if it had been heavily treated with blood meal or something similar over a very long period. A faint, almost subliminal alarm bell began to ring in Elena's mind. She remembered vaguely hearing local stories about the old Finch estate, something about a mad botanist. She decided to do a little research. The online archives of local newspapers and a few obscure regional history forums painted a fragmented but disturbing picture. Accounts of Alistair Finch, his reclusive nature, the exotic plant experiments, the gruesome events leading to his death, and the subsequent biohazard eradication of his greenhouse. The descriptions of Finch's monstrous plants, their blood-red leaves, and unnatural hunger sent a shiver down her spine. She looked again at her photographs of the weeds from the construction site. The resemblance, though muted, was undeniable. Wilted hope. That's what Elena felt. The hope for a straightforward landscaping project. The hope that these were just unusual but benign local plants. Now, a far more sinister possibility was taking root in her mind. Could these weeds be descendants? Survivors? Had the eradication not been as thorough as officially reported? The thought was both preposterous and terrifying. She tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination, fueled by macabre local folklore. But the scientific anomalies, the unidentified species, the bizarre soil composition, gnawed at her. She thought of the workers on the site, of the families who would soon be moving into these new homes, living their lives on land that might still harbor a deeply unnatural secret. Dr. Eris Thorne, in his university lab, was also experiencing a form of wilted hope, though of a different kind. His sanguinaria revivus, despite his meticulous care, was failing to thrive. It remained small, almost stunted, its crimson coloration disappointingly dull. It produced no blooms, showed none of the vigorous, almost sentient behavior that Finch's journals had so vividly described. Thorne was beginning to suspect that the organism was fundamentally damaged, its genetic potential irreparably compromised by the inferno it had miraculously survived. His groundbreaking research into extremophile biology was yielding frustratingly little. The plant was an enigma, but a rather pathetic one. He was considering terminating the experiment, consigning the Sanguinaria revivus to the autoclave, its secrets, if it held any, to remain locked within its stunted form. His scientific ambition was wilting under the weight of its unresponsiveness. He didn't know that his specimen lacked a crucial ingredient that its feral cousins on the Finch estate were now: albeit in minute quantities, beginning to receive again. The subtle, almost forgotten taste of fresh human blood. Elena Ramirez, her unease growing into genuine alarm, decided she had to act. She couldn't go to Marcus Thorne with her half-baked theories and folklore research. He would dismiss her as hysterical. She needed more concrete evidence. She remembered reading that one of the botanists involved in the original Finch investigation was still at the local university, a Dr. Thorne. Perhaps he could identify the plants, confirm or deny her fears. She arranged a meeting, bringing her samples, her photographs, and her growing sense of dread. When Dr. Thorne saw Elena's photographs, a jolt went through him. The plants were undeniably, terrifyingly familiar. They were cruder, wilder than his carefully cultivated Sanguinaria revivis. But the lineage was unmistakable. The leaf shape, the venation, the subtle crimson blush, it was all there. He listened, his face growing paler, as Elena described the patch. Its strange vigor, the peculiar soil, the faint, unsettling scent. His own wilted hope for a manageable, scientifically explicable specimen was suddenly, horrifyingly, revitalized into a new kind of dread. The Sanguinaria wasn't just in his lab. It was out there. It had survived in the wild, and it was on a construction site, surrounded by unsuspecting people. The carefully controlled experiment was about to collide with a much larger, far more dangerous reality. The past, Alistair Finch's bloody, terrifying past, was not dead. It had merely been dormant, biding its time, its roots sunk deep in the tainted earth, waiting for a new season, a new opportunity to bloom. And the first, faint drops of a new, unsuspecting harvest had already begun to fall. Chapter 12, The Blood Moon Blossom. The meeting between Elena Ramirez and Dr. Thorne was fraught with a tension that transcended mere professional concern. As Elena laid out her findings, the photographs of the robust, unervingly familiar weeds, the anomalous soil analysis, the half-forgotten local legends, Thorne felt a cold, not tighten in his stomach. His own carefully contained Sanguinaria revivis, stunted and disappointing in its sterile confines, was a pale echo of what Elena was describing. These wild descendants, thriving on the residue of Alistair Finch's grotesque horticulture and now, apparently, receiving fresh, albeit accidental, traces of human blood, were exhibiting the terrifying vigor of their progenitor. The implications were horrifying. These plants, Thorne said, his voice hushed, his gaze fixed on a particularly clear photograph of a dark leaf with its subtle, crimson veins. They're almost certainly related to the Finch specimens. I had theorized that some resilient spores might have survived the incineration. It seems my theory was correct, in the most unwelcome way. He explained, briefly and with carefully chosen words, the true nature of the original Sanguinaria nocturna, its absolute dependence on blood, its unnatural growth, its almost sentient qualities. He omitted the grislier details of Finch's methods. But Elena, connecting the dots with her own research, felt a wave of nausea. My God, she whispered. And they're right there, on a residential development site. People are working there. Families will be living there. Thorne nodded grimly. The original plants responded dramatically to human blood. If these descendants share that trait, and it appears they do, then any further accidental exposure could trigger a more aggressive growth phase. And their scent, the mature plants produced a highly alluring, potentially psychoactive perfume. He paused, the memory of that cloying, intoxicating aroma still vivid. It could draw people in, mask the danger. A sudden, chilling thought struck him. He remembered Finch's journals, the obsessive cataloging of the plant cycles. Finch had noted a correlation between its most spectacular blooming events and certain lunar phases, particularly the blood moon, a total lunar eclipse. Thorne quickly checked an astronomical calendar. A blood moon was due in less than a week. We need to act immediately, Thorne said, a new urgency in his voice. If these plants are preparing for a synchronous blooming event tied to the upcoming eclipse, their requirements for sustenance will escalate dramatically. The entire patch could become incredibly dangerous, actively predatory. Their first step was to try and convince Marcus Thorne of the danger. It was, as Elena had predicted, an uphill battle. Marcus, a man whose reality was dictated by profit margins and construction schedules, was deeply skeptical. Man iating vits. Dr. Thorne, with all due respect, this sounds like something out of a cheap horror movie. I've got millions invested in this project. But Eris Thorne, armed with his scientific credentials and the undeniable evidence of the plant samples, was persistent. He emphasized the potential biohazard, the unknown allergenic or toxic properties, the risk of lawsuits if any residents were harmed by these unidentified aggressive flora. He carefully avoided the more sensational aspects, focusing on public safety and liability. Reluctantly, faced with the botanist's grim certainty and Elena's palpable fear, Marcus agreed to a temporary halt on all work near the cordoned-off patch and to allow Dr. Thorne and a small, specialized team to assess and neutralize the plant specimens. He insisted, however, that it be done discreetly with minimal fuss. No hazmat suits and flashing lights, Thorne. I don't want a panic that scares off my buyers. Dr. Thorne assembled a small, trusted team. Elena, whose landscaping knowledge and familiarity with the site were invaluable. Two of his most discreet postgraduate researchers, briefed on the potential hazards, but not the full, gruesome history. And at Elena's hesitant suggestion, Big Tony, the construction foreman. Tony, despite his initial skepticism, knew the site intimately, and his practical, no-nonsense approach might be useful. More importantly, he had the trust of the other construction workers and could help manage the site discreetly. Their plan was to carefully excavate the entire patch, roots and all, contain the material in sealed biohazard bags, and transport it to a secure university facility for incineration, a more controlled, less dramatic version of the original eradication. They would work under the cover of early morning, before the main construction crews arrived. The days leading up to the planned excavation were filled with a gnawing tension. The weather turned unseasonably warm and humid for late autumn, the air heavy and still. On the construction site, the patch of sanguinaria weeds seemed to throb with a new, almost palpable energy. Their dark leaves took on a deeper, more lustrous sheen, the crimson veins glowing with an inner light. The faint, sweetish metallic scent intensified, now noticeable even from a short distance, a subtle, unsettling perfume that drifted on the humid air. Several workers reported feeling vaguely unwell when working downwind of the patch, headaches, slight nausea, a strange sense of disorientation. They attributed it to the unusual weather or a bad batch of coffee from the site canteen. As the blood moon approached, the changes in the weed patch became more dramatic. Small, tightly furrowed buds, the color of dried blood, began to appear at the tips of the taller stalks. They swelled with unnatural speed, promising a grotesque, synchronized bloom. The air around them felt charged, almost electric. Dr. Thorne, visiting the site daily with Elena to monitor the situation, grew increasingly alarmed. They're accelerating, he told her, his voice tight with anxiety. Their metabolism is ramping up. They're preparing for something big. The eclipse, it's definitely a trigger. On the eve of the blood moon, the night before the planned excavation, a security guard named Henderson was making his rounds of the Whispering Pines construction site. He was a retired cop, supplementing his pension, generally bored by the uneventful nature of the job. Tonight, however, the air felt different. Heavy, oppressive, and filled with that strange, sweet smell emanating from the fenced-off weed patch. He noticed it getting stronger over the past few days. He found himself drawn towards it, a strange curiosity battling with a vague unease. The moonlight, already tinged with a faint coppery hue as the Earth's shadow began to creep across its surface, cast eerie shadows. The weed patch seemed almost to glow from within. the dark leaves and swelling buds possessing a sinister beauty. Henderson leaned against the flimsy orange fence, peering in. The perfume was stronger here, almost intoxicating. He felt a little dizzy, a pleasant languor spreading through his limbs. He should move on, continue his patrol. But he felt compelled to stay to watch. The buds were visibly swelling now, some of them beginning to unfurl, revealing glimpses of velvety, blood-red petals within. It was the most beautiful and the most unsettling thing he had ever seen. He didn't notice the fine, almost invisible tendrils that seemed to uncoil from the base of the nearest plants, creeping silently through the grass towards his feet. He didn't hear the soft, collective sigh that seemed to emanate from the patch, a sound like a drawn-out, hungry breath. He just felt the pull, the allure of the blood moon blossom, drawing him closer to a harvest he would not live to witness. Dr. Thorne and his team were due to arrive at dawn. They had no idea that the garden, anticipating its grand celestial event, had decided not to wait. The first, crucial offering for its blood moon celebration was already within its grasp. The hunt had begun. Chapter 13, the final offering. The first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky with streaks of bruised purple and blood orange as DR. Thorne's discreetly marked university van pulled up to the silent construction site of Whispering Pines Estates. Elena Ramirez sat in the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee clutched in her hands, though her stomach was too knotted with anxiety to contemplate drinking it. In the back, Thorne's two postgraduate researchers, Ben and Sarah, a grim coincidence of name with one of the teenagers who had previously encountered the patch, were subdued, their initial scientific curiosity now heavily laced with apprehension after Thorne's necessarily vague but ominous briefing. Big Tony, the foreman, was already there, his pickup truck parked near the site office. He met them with a grunt, his weathered face etched with a mixture of skepticism and a grudging respect for Dr. Thorne's obvious concern. "Place is quiet," Tony observed, his gaze sweeping the deserted site. "Too quiet. Henderson, the night guard, should have checked in by now. His truck's still here, but no sign of him." A fresh spike of alarm lanced through Thorne. He exchanged a worried glance with Elena. "Let's get to the patch," he said, his voice tight. "Quickly." They gathered their equipment: heavy-duty biohazard bags, long-handled cutting tools, soil samplers, and portable containment units. As they approached the cordoned-off area, the air grew thick with the sanguinaria's perfume, now almost overwhelmingly potent, a cloying, sweet, and undeniably carnal scent that seemed to writhe in the still morning air. The sight that greeted them stopped them in their tracks. The flimsy orange fence had been breached, several sections torn down as if something had been dragged through. And the weed patch itself, it was transformed. Overnight, it had erupted into a grotesque, vibrant tapestry of blood-red blooms. Hundreds of them, each one a velvety, gaping maw, pulsed gently in the eerie light of the fading blood moon, which still hung low in the western sky. They were larger, more numerous, and more terrifyingly beautiful than anything Thorne had anticipated. Their collective scent was a physical presence, pressing in on them, making their heads swim. And then they saw Henderson, or rather, what was left of him. He lay partially within the patch, his body entangled in a network of thick, disturbingly mobile vines and tendrils that seemed to have sprouted from the base of the larger plants. His security uniform was torn, stained dark. His face, visible above the crimson foliage, was a mask of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. The sanguinaria plants were clustered around him, their blood-red blooms nodding gently, some of them almost brushing against his exposed skin. It was a scene of silent, vegetative horror. Sarah, one of Thorne's researchers, let out a choked gasp and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Ben looked like he was about to be sick. Big Tony swore a low, horrified rumble. Elena felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Thorne, though equally horrified, forced himself to remain analytical. That they actively took him. He breathed, his scientific detachment shattering. The tendrils, I didn't anticipate this level of aggressive mobility. The plants, sated for the moment, seemed almost languid, their blooms exuding a triumphant, intoxicating perfume. But as the group stood there, frozen in shock, a new movement began within the patch. The leaves rustled, not from any breeze, but with an internal agitation. The blooms turned slowly, almost deliberately, towards the newcomers. A low, collective hum. The sound Thorn remembered so vividly from Alistair Finch's journals and his own suppressed memories of the original greenhouse began to emanate from the patch, growing in intensity. It was a sound of hunger, of awakening, of invitation. "We need to get out of here," Big Tony said, his voice raspy. "This ain't right. This ain't natural. We can't just leave him," Elena said, her voice trembling, though the thought of approaching that writhing, blood-fed mass was terrifying. "And we have to contain these things." Thorn knew they were in an incredibly dangerous situation. The plants were clearly active, predatory, and had just been fed. Their behavior was escalating far beyond anything he had predicted. "Tony, Elena, stay back," Thorn commanded, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Ben, Sarah, get the long-range herbicide sprayers from the van. We may have to resort to a more aggressive containment strategy than planned." But as Ben and Sarah turned to retreat, the sanguinaria patch exploded into motion. Tendrils, thick as pythons and astonishingly fast, whipped out from the foliage, lashing towards them. One wrapped around Ben's ankle, yanking him off his feet with incredible force. He cried out as he was dragged, scrabbling, towards the edge of the patch. Sarah screamed, trying to pull him free, but more tendrils snaked out, entangling her arms. Big Tony, roaring in fury, charged forward, swinging a heavy crowbar he'd grabbed from his truck. He brought it down with crushing force on one of the thick tendrils, which recoiled as if in pain, a dark, viscous sap oozing from a gash. But for every tendril he struck, two more seemed to emerge, their blood-red tips quivering. Elena, overcoming her fear, grabbed a heavy-duty branch lopper from their pile of equipment and rushed to help Sarah, hacking at the tendrils that held her. The severed ends writhed like dying snakes, spraying more of the strange, dark sap. Thorn, seeing his researchers in mortal danger, knew that their careful, scientific approach was useless. This was a battle. He grabbed a canister of highly concentrated industrial defoliant, a last resort he'd brought, hoping not to use it, and fumbled with the nozzle, his hands shaking. The air was filled with screams, roars, the sickening thud of Tony's crowbar, and the incessant, hungry hum of the plants. The blooms themselves seemed to writhe on their stalks, their perfume intensifying to a suffocating, mind-altering degree. Elena managed to free Sarah, who scrambled away, sobbing, her arms raw and bleeding. But Ben was being relentlessly dragged deeper into the patch, the plants around Henderson's body parting to receive him. Big Tony, fighting like a cornered bear, was surrounded, tendrils lashing at him from all sides, one coiling around his thick neck. He gasped, his face turning purple. Thorn finally got the sprayer working. He aimed it at the densest part of the patch, at the monstrous blooms that seemed to be orchestrating the attack, and unleashed a torrent of the corrosive chemicals. There was a horrific, hissing sizzle as the defoliant hit the plants. The vibrant crimson leaves blackened and curled almost instantly, the beautiful, terrible blooms shriveling as if touched by acid. A sound like 1,000 tortured screams erupted from the patch. A high-pitched, unearthly wail that was far more terrifying than any human cry. The tendrils attacking Tony and dragging Ben faltered, some retracting, others spasming violently. Tony, gasping for air, managed to break free, stumbling back, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. Elena and Sarah pulled a dazed, bleeding Ben from the edge of the patch just as the plants around him began to thrash in their death throes. Thorn continued to spray, relentlessly dousing the entire area. The chemical fumes acrid and choking, mingling with the dying perfume of the sanguinaria. He didn't stop until the entire patch was a smoking, blackened, writhing ruin. The unearthly screaming gradually subsided, replaced by a sickening, gurgling sound like a giant, dying beast. Then silence. A profound, unnatural silence, broken only by the ragged, gasping breaths of the survivors. They stood there, amidst the carnage, Henderson's still form entangled in the now limp tendrils, the ground soaked with chemical foam and dark, viscous sap, the air thick with the stench of burnt vegetation, and something else, something indescribably foul. The blood moon, now pale and insignificant in the brightening sky, looked down on a scene of utter devastation. The final offering had been made, not by Alistair Finch, but by the unsuspecting guardians of his legacy. The Sanguine Garden, in its wild, resurgent form, had claimed its due, but this time, its terrible hunger had been met with a force it could not overcome, or so they hoped, as Thorne stared at the smoking, twitching remnants of the plants, a single, chilling thought pierced through his exhaustion and horror. Finch's original seed pod had come from somewhere. These plants, these terrestrial horrors, were merely an offshoot, an echo. What if the true, ultimate root of this insatiable hunger was not on Earth at all? What if the sanguinaria was merely a symptom of something far older, far vaster, and far more patient? The silence of the devastated patch felt less like an ending and more like a pause. Chapter 14, Ash and Petals. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of sirens, flashing lights, and grim-faced emergency services descending upon Whispering Pines estates. Paramedics worked frantically on Ben, whose leg was badly lacerated and who was suffering from shock and exposure to the plant's toxins. Big Tony, though bruised and shaken, refused medical attention beyond a cursory check, his gruff exterior barely concealing the profound horror in his eyes. Sarah and Elena, physically less harmed but deeply traumatized, gave disjointed, terrified accounts to the first responding officers. Henderson, the unfortunate security guard, was pronounced dead at the scene, his body carefully extricated from the now inert but still menacing tendrils. Dr. Eris Thorne, exhausted and smelling faintly of chemicals and the plant's dying effluvia, found himself at the center of a storm. He was the expert, the one who had understood, at least partially, the nature of the threat. He briefed the bewildered police captain and the incoming hazmat teams, his voice flat, almost robotic, as he recounted the morning's horrific events and the underlying, unbelievable biology of the sanguinaria. The construction site was immediately declared a biohazard zone of the highest order. Marcus Thorne, when he arrived, his face ashen, his dreams of profit margins and rustic executive homes dissolving into a nightmare of liability and public scandal, could only stare in mute horror at the scene. The wild garden feature had become a monstrous death trap. The process of neutralizing and clearing the site was far more intensive and meticulous than Alistair Finch's original greenhouse eradication. Teams in full biohazard suits, armed with flamethrowers and industrial chemical sprayers, systematically incinerated every trace of the sanguinaria patch, then treated the soil with a cocktail of sterilizing agents, so potent it would likely render the ground barren for decades. The ashes, along with several feet of topsoil, were carefully excavated, sealed in specialized containers, and transported under armed guard to a high-security bio-waste disposal facility. The official story, carefully crafted by county officials, public health representatives, and a tight-lipped university administration eager to distance itself from Dr. Thorne's more esoteric research, was one of an unidentified, highly aggressive, and toxic invasive plant species. The death of Henderson and the injuries to the construction workers were attributed to severe allergic reactions and contact poisoning. The more fantastical elements, the plant's predatory behavior, their apparent sentience, their specific craving for blood, the blood moon connection, were quietly suppressed, relegated to internal reports and hushed, disbelieving whispers among those who had been there. Dr. Thorne's career was, predictably, over. While he was lauded in some quiet corners for his bravery and quick action in neutralizing the immediate threat, the university, under immense pressure, initiated a review of his research protocols. His unorthodox methodologies and the potential for uncontrolled biological release, a gross understatement of what had actually occurred with his Sanguinaria revivus specimen, which was quietly and thoroughly autoclaved into oblivion, led to his contract not being renewed. He became a pariah in the mainstream scientific community, a man tainted by association with something too strange, too horrifying to be comfortably acknowledged. Elena Ramirez left the landscaping business altogether, haunted by the memory of the blood-red blooms and the unnatural hunger she had witnessed. She moved to a different state, seeking anonymity and a career as far removed from botany as possible. Big Tony retired, selling his construction business and retreating to a small cabin in the mountains, where the only plants were simple, honest pines and ferns. Ben and Sarah, the postgraduate researchers, completed their degrees under a new supervisor, their theses carefully scrubbed of any mention of their terrifying fieldwork. They never spoke of the Sanguinaria again, not even to each other. The Whispering Pines Estate's development was, of course, dead in the water. The land, now irrevocably tainted by its gruesome history and the intensive chemical sterilization, was declared unfit for habitation. Marcus Thorne's company went bankrupt, his reputation ruined. The site became another blighted monument, a testament to greed, ignorance, and the terrifying resilience of Alistair Finch's legacy. The ash and petals, both literal and metaphorical, settled. The immediate horror faded, replaced by the mundane processes of official reports, insurance claims, and legal wrangling. The world moved on, eager to forget the brief, terrifying bloom of the sanguine garden on its doorstep. But for those who had been there, for those who had looked into the crimson heart of that monstrous beauty and felt its cold, insatiable hunger, the memory would never truly fade. They knew that what had been destroyed was perhaps only a symptom, a localized outbreak of something far more deeply rooted. Dr. Aris Thorne, now living in quiet obscurity, spent his days in public libraries, poring over ancient botanical texts, obscure folklore, and fringe theories about panspermia and extraterrestrial life. His scientific curiosity, though battered, had not been extinguished, it had merely been redirected. He was haunted by Alistair Finch's initial discovery, the unknown seed pod, its smudged postmark from some forgotten corner of the globe. Where had it come from? What other horrors, what other sentient, bloodthirsty flora might exist in the unexplored jungles of the world, or perhaps beyond it? He found scattered, tantalizing references, medieval accounts of blood-drinking trees in remote, shunned forests, Amazonian legends of flower demons that lured victims to their doom with intoxicating perfumes. Even speculative scientific papers from the early 20th century, quickly dismissed as fantasy, proposing the existence of silicon-based, predatory plant life on other planets. These are just fragments, whispers, easily dismissed as myth or madness. But Thorne, having witnessed the impossible, could no longer afford such easy dismissals. He knew that the Sanguinaria, in its terrestrial form, had been a devastating anomaly. But the chilling thought that never left him was that Alistair Finch's seed pod might not have been unique. It might have been just one of many, scattered across the cosmos, waiting for the right conditions, the right unwitting gardener, the right offering of blood to take root and bloom. The ashes on the Finch land, and now on the cursed ground of Whispering Pines, were a testament to a battle won. But the petals, the memory of their terrible beauty and insatiable hunger, hinted at a war that might be far from over. The sanguine garden, in its most fundamental, cosmic sense, might simply be dormant, its seeds drifting through the void, waiting for another fertile world, another unsuspecting civilization, to cultivate its next, and perhaps even more terrible, crimson harvest. The price, it seemed, was always waiting to be paid. Chapter 15. The Enduring Seed. Years later, the Whispering Pines estate site remained a desolate, fenced-off scar on the landscape, a place shunned and whispered about and hushed. Fearful tones by the locals. The potent chemical sterilizers had done their work. Nothing grew there now, not even the hardiest weeds. It was a dead zone, a monument to a horror that the county was still trying to live down. The official narrative had solidified, a tragic incident involving an aggressive, toxic plant, exacerbated by the negligence of a now-bankrupt developer. The true, unbelievable nature of the sanguinaria was a secret known only to a handful of traumatized survivors and filed away in heavily redacted government reports. Dr. Eris Thorne, his academic career a distant memory, lived a quiet, solitary life. He had channeled his obsessive curiosity into a sprawling, unpublished manuscript, a vast compendium of every myth, legend, and obscure scientific reference he could find relating to predatory flora, hemotrophic organisms, and potential extraterrestrial botany. It was a madman's Bible, a scholar's folly, filled with meticulously cross-referenced accounts of blood roses from forgotten Amazonian tribes, corpse lilies whispered about in medieval Transylvanian folklore, and even declassified, heavily censored snippets from Cold War-era reports hinting at Soviet experiments with weaponized botanical agents that exhibited disturbing, unnatural appetites. He knew no reputable publisher would touch it. It was too fantastical, too horrifying, too unbelievable. Yet, he continued to write, driven by a need to understand, to catalog the potential for such horrors to exist, perhaps to warn a world that wouldn't listen. He often thought of Alistair Finch, not as a monster, but as a tragic, brilliant fool, a man seduced by a beauty so alien and demanding it had consumed him. Finch had been the first gardener, the unwitting cultivator of an extraterrestrial terror. Thorne himself had been the second, a more cautious but ultimately equally powerless custodian. And now, the question that haunted Thorne's solitary nights was, who would be the third? Elsewhere, in a state-of-the-art astrobiology research facility, a young, ambitious scientist named Dr. Lena Hansen was examining meteorite samples collected from a recent Antarctic expedition. One particular chondrite, designated ALMH 814, showed unusual organic signatures, complex carbon compounds that hinted at prebiotic or even primitive biotic processes occurring far beyond Earth. Deep within a microfissure in ALMH 814, shielded from the sterilizing radiation of space and the frictional heat of atmospheric entry, was a single, microscopic particle. It was incredibly dense, its outer shell composed of a silicon chitin matrix that had protected its precious cargo for an unimaginable journey across the void. It was not a spore in the terrestrial sense, but something far more resilient, more alien, a dormant seed form perfectly adapted for interstellar travel and long periods of stasis. Dr. Hansen, using advanced imaging techniques, noted the particle, cataloging it as unidentified biogenic particulate X. It was intriguing, but her primary focus was on the more readily identifiable amino acids and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons found elsewhere in the meteorite. The particle was archived, along with hundreds of other microscopic curiosities for potential future study. No one knew that unidentified biogenic particulate X was, in fact, a seed of the cosmosanguinaria, the true, interstellar progenitor of Alistair Finch's terrible garden. It had journeyed for eons, one of countless billions scattered from some ancient, dying world, a world where such life forms had perhaps been the apex predators. It needed no soil as humans understood it, no conventional photosynthesis. It needed only a catalyst, a specific biosignature, a trace of complex protein and iron, readily available in the blood of most advanced life forms, to awaken its ravenous, patient hunger. And so it waited, dormant and unnoticed, in a sterile vial. within a secure government laboratory, surrounded by cutting-edge technology and the brightest minds in astrobiology. It waited, just as its terrestrial descendants had waited in the tainted earth of the Finch estate, just as Thorne's stunted Sanguinaria revivus had waited in its terrarium. The final scene, a remote, densely forested region of the Pacific Northwest. A small, off-grid cabin, home to an elderly recluse, a former botanist who had retreated from the world decades ago, disillusioned with academia. He spends his days tending to his small, isolated garden, experimenting with rare and unusual plants he orders from obscure international catalogs. A package arrives, postmarked from a small, almost untraceable import-export company in Southeast Asia. A company that sometimes deals in ethnobotanical curiosities of dubious legality and unverified origin. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves, is a single dull, ovoid seed pod, its surface covered in faint, vein-like tracings. It looks remarkably similar to the one Alistair Finch received so many years ago. The old botanist, his curiosity piqued by its unfamiliar appearance, smiles. He has a new project. He takes the seed pod to his small, cluttered greenhouse. He prepares a pot of rich, dark loam. The enduring seed, in one of its myriad, patient forms, had found fertile ground once more. The cycle was poised to begin anew. The price will be paid. The garden would bloom. And there you have it. The Garden of the Dead. A chilling reminder that some seeds are best left unsown. Some thirsts best left unquenched. What did you think of Alistair Finch's descent into madness? And that final, chilling implication? Let me know your thoughts, your theories, your deepest fears down in the comments below. If this tale of botanical horror sent shivers down your spine and kept you glued to the very end, please consider giving this video a like. It truly helps the channel and my own monstrous creations to grow. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Eli Nightfall and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next journey into the shadows. We have many more dark gardens to explore together. Until next time, try not to think too much about what might be stirring in your own backyard after dark. Sleep well if you can.